Order. The committee is now in session. The Science and Technology Committee is delighted to be in Manchester today at the University of Manchester to continue our inquiry into the role of technology, research and innovation in the COVID-19 recovery, but as part of that to inquire about the prospects and the opportunities that we have for the nations and regions of the UK to make the fullest contribution possible. And for the first of our sessions outside Westminster, there is no better place to be than a place forever associated with technology, which is the city of Manchester. So it is very good to be here. We're in the University of Manchester. Our first panel of witnesses, our first pair of witnesses, are two professors at this university. Very pleased to welcome, but also to be the guests of Professor Luke Georgiou, who is the Deputy President and Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester, and Professor Richard Jones, who is Vice President for Regional Innovation and Civic Engagement, and also Professor at this university. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and thank you for having us today. Perhaps I can start with a question to Professor Jones. As I said, everyone associates around the world Manchester with technology over the ages. But if we look at the figures, the level of research and development spending, investment in the Northwest, at least, is below the national average. Give us a feeling for why that might be and whether that is inevitable and reflects things that we can't help, or what we should be doing about it, bearing in mind that we'll be going into a bit more detail later in the session.
Yes, I think that this question of the concentration of research, this is something that's happened over quite a long time. So the figure that I have in my mind is that 46% of all public and charitable R&D happens in London and the two regions that contain Oxford and Cambridge. So there's no doubt, I mean, it's not just a question of Manchester, the distribution of public research money across the country is very uneven. And that's been a consequence partly, I think, of deliberate decisions. I think that there has been a time when the idea has been, particularly when funding seemed tight, that it would be better to concentrate money in places that were, centres of a few centres. But also there's just a general tendency that funding, when it's given out competitively, without regard for place, there's a natural tendency for concentration. Good people go to where existing facilities are. That allows them to write stronger bids, and in that case, there's a self-reinforcing element. So that's a process that's played out over quite a long time, and it's got us to this, the situation of quite extreme imbalance, I think. I've been talking there about public R&D. I think it's very important to think about private R&D as well. And that there's an interesting disparity between where the private sector invests its R&D money and where the public sector does. So one finds places like Cambridge, which are kind of remarkable places where there's a lot of public sector R&D, but then the private sector piles in with a great deal of money behind that. Those are really great places, things that the country should be proud of and encourage. But particularly the Northwest, in common East Midlands and West Midlands too, we have a situation where actually the private sector is investing quite a lot of in R&D, but the public sector isn't really following those market signals and, in a sense, exploiting what in many ways are innovation economies that could be much stronger by backing that up with more public funding.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So the public sector lags the private sector in terms of investment in the Northwest.
That's right.
Yeah. Professor Georgiou, perhaps you're a great expert and written extensively about science policy. This classic perennial question of the role of place versus a kind of place-blind approach to investment is something that you and your colleagues have thought about. What's your take on where we are at the moment?
Well, I'd first of all like to follow what my colleague was saying, that what we have in places in this country is a consequence, in part, of the past distribution pattern. But nonetheless, each place does have possibilities that are not experienced elsewhere. There's an ability to set local priorities which are attuned to the needs of the region. Sometimes these can be quite historically based. Older industries nonetheless leave you with capabilities that can be transformed into possibilities for the future, and similarly concentrations of research and development do that as well. Beyond that, places combine with R&D a number of other assets. They have a skill profile. They often have a public procurement profile, to introduce one of my favorite topics in the R&D space. So cities are major purchasers of a number of key goods and are able to drive the direction of business investment and, following on that, R&D investment as well.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll return to my colleagues. The Science and Technology Committee is fortunate, but perhaps not surprising, to benefit from many members from the North-West. And I'm going to turn to one of those first, one standing member of the committee, Graham Street.
Thank you. If I could just follow up. Sorry, thank you. If I can just follow up with what Professor Jones was saying about money following excellence. How, if one wants, as Manchester wants, both the university and the city, to have place-based policies, how do you get over the allocation of science funds being done quite sensibly on the Haldane principle?
Well, I think the Haldane principle is interpreted in a number of different ways. I think the way the government currently interprets it is that decisions ought to be made on the basis of expert advice.
Professor Jones, would you just say what the Haldane principle is for our viewers who may not be as au fait with it as members of the committee and our witnesses?
Yes, I'll try and be brief too, because I could probably talk for a long time about this. The Haldane principle is something that is believed to derive from a paper that was written by Viscount Haldane in 1917, when the Medical Research Council was set up. And it basically, what it said was that although the government had the right, or the duty to kind of set strategic priorities, decisions about research funding should be informed by expert opinion. I think that at the level of individual research projects, that's a fine principle. But I think it applies. It doesn't apply to all science funding. Science and technology funding. It's never applied to funding in departments, which historically has taken up a huge amount of funding. And currently it's interpreted in the light of discovery-based research that takes place, that's funded by research councils, and it takes place in universities. And I think that's an important part. Excellence is really important, but that's not the only reason that we invest money in science and technology. And I think it's quite right that the government should take into account strategic priorities, whether that's about, it's priorities like net zero in terms of thematic priorities, or indeed priorities about economic development, where it thinks that needs to happen.
So is the answer to that to rebalance the science expenditure more towards place and less towards absolute excellence?
Well, excellence is a word.
Excellence is a good thing.
Excellent. There are different criteria for excellence, aren't there? There's excellence in terms of how it's perceived by the international community of scientists. There's excellence as it translates into impact, and we've rightly seen a lot of emphasis in science policy in the last 10 years on this idea of impact. What difference does it make to people's lives? How does it translate into health outcomes? How does it translate into economic outcomes? I think those are really important. So I think, in a sense, I would say that deciding priorities for science is too important to be left to academic scientists.
Thank you. Just, I think, a final question on this section. The drift of great scientists to the Golden Triangle has been going on for a long time. Rutherford discovered the nucleus of the atom a quarter of a mile down the road in what's now a committee room, sadly. And Rutherford left Manchester and went to the Cavendish afterwards. Do you think it's possible to stop that drift? Because money also follows great scientists as well as institutions. And Manchester University is a world-class university. But do you think it is possible to stop that drift and get Manchester University and some of the other great northern universities up the pecking order to be in the same region as Imperial and Oxford and Cambridge?
Yes, I think that there is scope to do that. You mentioned Rutherford. I used to teach in the Cavendish myself, so I've made the reverse journey.
Good.
But the point I think that's really important to hold on is we talk about excellence, and people will loosely say Cambridge is excellent. Cambridge isn't excellent. Cambridge is a place that has lots of excellent people. The thing that defines excellence is people, and people will respond to facilities. If we create excellent facilities, we create an excellent environment, then excellent people from all over the world will want to come to those places. So I think it's possible to be too deterministic about this. I think one can create the environment that will attract excellent people from all over the world, and I think that's what we ought to aim to do if we want to spread out scientific excellence across the country.
So to simplify that answer, the answer is for investment in absolutely world-class kit in universities away from the Golden Triangle.
It's world-class kit, but also it's the wider intellectual climate. Excellent colleagues. People like to go where they're excellent colleagues, excellent students. That's the package that you need.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leeds. I'm going to turn to another of our colleagues from the area, Rebecca Long-Bailey, who is the member for Salford and Eccles. Rebecca.
Thanks very much, and thanks both for coming to the committee today. I just wanted to return to the point that I think you both touched on already about levelling up. Now, Andy Haldane, a different Haldane, from the Bank of England, came to the committee in March and stated that it was still the case that a lot of research and development investment was still skewed towards London. Indeed, when you look at the figures, I think Nesta did a report that showed that the North West particularly was £171 per head less than the national average, which is quite staggering. But certainly there's a lot of talk within government circles about levelling up. Are you feeling that? Have you seen any indication yet so far that we're going to see any significant changes in terms of R&D investment here in Greater Manchester? I'll start with Professor Jones.
No, I'm glad you mentioned the Nesta report, because I wrote that with my colleague Tom Forth. I think the figures were very striking. I think they have made an impact. I think that this has, that we hear more discussion of this than we've had some time. We have we have for the first time place-based funding instruments in UKRI. So the Strength in Places Fund is a new fund that's specifically aimed at growing capacity outside the Golden Triangle. I think that's a good fund, and I should declare an interest. I was on the panel for that, so I've seen the process. I think it's been really good to see people coming together with quite compelling propositions. The problem is that fund is very small. It's only a few hundred million out of a UKRI budget that's 8 billion or so. So it's promising, but it's under scale. So, I'd also add, one of the big funding opportunities, particularly for more translational research, has come from European structural funds. And of course, we await news of the successor to that fund. And I think it would be really desirable if the government gave a strong signal that would have a significant innovation element.
Fantastic, thank you. And Professor Georgiou, same question.
Thank you. I wouldn't like you to have the impression that we're somehow looking for welfare in research funding, as some might put it. I mean, our university was actually the most successful in winning competitive grant funding from UK RI in the past year. But there's some areas of funding which are structurally not level, tilted, maybe that's the word, particularly in the health field, which is locked into London institutions in ways that under current structures we simply can't unlock.
Thank you very much, that's very helpful. And in terms of the broader research and development spend picture, the government is aiming for 2.4% of GDP, whilst I'm sure you both know many of the leading OECD nations are aiming upwards of 3%. Do you think 2.4% is enough, Professor Georgiou?
No, I mean, I would endorse what your committee chair said in a recent article. It's a good step on the way, because we should certainly not be below average, but it should be seen as a staging post. The leading countries are well ahead of that already and are increasing their investment in R&D. And the kind of areas we're likely to be talking about later in this meeting are R&D intensive, and if we're going to be competitive, we're going to have to make those investments. I'd also like, while we're on that subject, to refer to some good work by the Russell Group on the profile of that increase. They have raised concerns that if we have a hockey stick increase, so we increase it slowly now and then try to catch up right at the end, we could lose, according to their model, half of the benefit. I mean, we're talking about a benefit of 5 billion of induced private sector research in 3 years. If we follow a level progression, half of that if we have the hockey stick shape.
Professor Jones?
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with those comments. I mean, our current position is between the Czech Republic and Italy in terms of R&D intensity. 2.4% would bring us up into the range of about to Belgium. That is a long way away from our aspirations as a science superpower, as the Prime Minister likes to say. I think the point that Professor Georgiou made, I'd like to really underline about private sector investment. 2.4%, you know, as a rule of thumb, we expect the private sector to put in £2 for every £1 that the public sector puts in. And so this needs to involve both private sector investment, but that private sector investment needs to be pump primed, if you like, by public sector investment. And so, you know, as 2027 approaches, if one leaves it too late to do the public sector investment, the private sector won't follow. And I will also emphasise, I mean, I think, you know, these are very big numbers that we're talking about here. You know, we're talking about tens of billions of extra spending from the private sector. And actually, I think that amounts in some ways to, you know, quite a considerable reshaping of the UK economy. Now, I think we need to reshape the UK economy anyway, because to rebalance it towards the Midlands and the North, and to meet huge goals like net zero, which is, you know, a really massive challenge. So I think none of us should underestimate what a big challenge getting to 2.4% would be, even though it still doesn't put us at the leading rank of innovative nations.
Thanks, that's very helpful. And then one very brief question. There are concerns, shall we say, that the government might delay its commitment to increase R&D investment to 22 billion by 2024-25, perhaps shifting the date further. What kind of an impact would that have on R&D here in Greater Manchester, starting with Professor Jones?
Well, I think, yes, I mean, it is a worry. I mean, the date for 22 billion appeared in the March 2020 budget with a 24-25 date on it. That date has mysteriously evaporated from recent announcements. You know, and in a way, I mean, I can understand, you know, the fiscal situation is very difficult. I think the key thing actually we need to have is certainty that that 22 billion will arrive. It'll be 22 billion of real spending. You know, there are various ways in which one can imagine the government might try and game the figures, as it were. So, you know, one would like to see a real increase from 14.9 to 22. And, you know, if they say that the situation is different, we have to delay it, okay, but let's see a timetable, let's allow people to plan, let's allow private sector to plan to meet that.
Professor George, you.
Yeah, just to add to what Professor Jones has said, clearly affordability is an issue. Everyone has to be realistic about that. But in terms of getting the benefits, if we were a business, exactly the right time to invest would be in a counter cycle, not waiting for the economic cycle to go up. The benefits are bigger by spending sooner.
Thank you, that's great.
Thank you, Rebecca. Perhaps just to follow up on a couple of the points that Rebecca made, going back to the Strength in Places Fund that Professor Jones mentioned, which is this fund of UKRI. You said it's a few hundred million out of a budget of 8 billion plus. We'll come on to the question as to whether the overall science budget is rising or is static. But were it to be static, would you be saying that money should be transferred into the Strength in Places Fund or comparable funds within UKRI from those allocations that are not place-based?
Well, I mean, you put me in a difficult position in the sense that one hopes that if the government is serious about meeting its 2.4% target, it shouldn't be imposing a flat cash settlement on UKRI. And one would, you know, if there are, it would be very difficult to imagine that it's going to be helpful for the economic position of the UK to be taking money out of core subject specific research budgets. But I think, you know, that UKRI does have to address the fact that, you know, it now has this more responsibility for place. Place is now a factor in research funding that hasn't happened. If Strength in Places is not the instrument through which that happens, I think UKRI perhaps could think about how else it could contribute to rebalancing R&D expenditure across the country.
Thank you. As you say, clearly it wouldn't be a step towards achieving the status of a science superpower if we were to be reducing core budgets. So the opportunity to have a greater quantity of regional investment comes from an increase in the budget. But so is it fair to infer logically from that of the increase you would expect a higher proportion to be regionally distributed than the current snapshot of the budget?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, and you know, if we take the government at its word about saying that there are going to be genuine increases in R&D, this does give us a unique opportunity, because we have had quite flat research budgets for, you know, for a couple of decades, really. And so up to now, we have always been faced with that problem. Do you really want to take money away from the excellence of Oxford and Cambridge and to rebalance? And I think that is a difficult issue because, you know, as I said in my opening remarks, I think Cambridge is a fantastic asset to the UK's economy. But if we have got this opportunity to see rising budgets, you know, if we going from 14.9 to 22 billion, that's that 7 billion of rise that's been penciled in. It would be very disappointing if some, you know, if a reasonable fraction of that wasn't really ring-fenced to start to address these imbalances, and, you know, specifically with the aim of boosting the economy of those places whose productivity is too low that we need to raise. So I think, you know, tying it very directly to the government's goals of levelling up, increasing the productivity of economically lagging regions, as well as its other very important goals of net zero, that I think that would be entirely reasonable.
And that is literally and specifically what you're describing, is it not levelling up, in the sense that you said you don't want to take down the budgets of existing institutions, you want to increase the others, so that is levelling up.
Indeed.
Indeed. Catherine wants to come in.
Thank you, Chair.
You need to press the button, Catherine.
It's the opposite of you're on mute, isn't it? Hello, gentlemen. Thanks very much. With the government's recently been putting through ARIA agency, which is, certainly as billed at least, higher risk, higher reward, longer term opportunities. And I just wondered if you could describe what the University of Manchester could bring to that space outside of the perhaps more conventional evaluation of R&D that's going on within UKRA at the moment. I will confess an interest in and perhaps pride in our ability to creatively come up with something. So could that be an opportunity for growth outside of conventional areas? Perhaps to Professor Georgiou first.
Yes, well, we have had some opportunity of that kind of funding with what's called QR funding in the past, which we've been able to deploy ourselves and use that to make the underpinning investments that have led to the position we are in graphene, which you'll be hearing about in more detail from my colleague later on. So definitely the ability to invest in high risk, high reward research is good. I think ARIA, as I understand it, is trying to meet two different goals. I mean, one is the high risk, high reward one, and the other is the kind of pull through that its model DARPA in the US has achieved. And it's quite difficult to meet both of those goals at the same time.
Yeah. Professor Jones.
Yeah, I mean, I think ARIA is an interesting experiment in science funding. And, as scientists, we experiment. We ought to experiment in the way we fund science too. And, I'm supportive of that. I think the idea, we will see how it finally shakes out. But, the idea of having strongly empowered program managers who are able to kind of pull up a project together, keep a really close eye on it, but can take some big risks. Those are all good goals. I think we should, we shouldn't forget what a small part. The DARPA, the US model for ARIA is a big program that's achieved some impressive results, but in the context of the US's overall research and development spending, it's pretty small. And, that's going to be the same in the UK. ARIA, we've seen figures of 800 million over a parliament penciled in. That's not nothing, but again, in the context of, as I say, of a government R&D budget that's this year 14.9 billion, it's not very much. So I think of it, it's an experiment. We don't know how it'll go, because how it will go will depend on the chief executive and the program managers that are appointed. I think it's worth trying, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just before I turn to Aaron Bell and then Dawn Butler, in terms of just following up Rebecca's question about the commitment to 22 billion a year by 2024-5 of science funding. Now, the committee took evidence on ARIA from Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's former chief advisor. And he told the committee that doubling the science budget was one of the conditions for him agreeing to serve the Prime Minister in Downing Street. And in his writings, you are very widely cited, your writings are very widely cited as having convinced him, or perhaps added to his case, that this big increase, unprecedented increase in science funding should take place. So just a couple of questions around that, if I hope you don't think it's prying into personal matters, but Were you involved in those discussions, or was he, as it were, a fan of your written work?
Well, he read some of my written work. Yes, I mean, I'd been in a meeting with him in September 2019 to talk about ARIA, but that was a big meeting, many people. So I was. The piece of work that he was particularly influenced by was a bit of writing called Resurgence of the Regions, which was really just an attempt to spell out what I thought an innovation-based industrial strategy ought to look like, aiming at levelling up well, I probably didn't use that word, but I mean, I think that's what I meant, trying to equalise productivity, raise the productivity of lagging regions. I talked a lot about net zero, the very considerable innovation that would need to go into making net zero deliverable and affordable. I still think those are really important points. I talked about healthcare, and Professor Georgie has already mentioned the kind of lock-in of healthcare research in the Golden Triangle. I talked about aligning the research agenda of biomedical research and healthcare-related research more closely to the actual health needs of our population, particularly thinking about imbalances in health outcomes that we see across the country that pretty much actually map economic outcomes. So I mean, it was quite a long paper that went into many arguments about those things. I first, it was Dominic Cummings mentioned that in a blog. I hadn't had any conversations with him about it, so it was entirely him picking up on my written work. And I did talk to him on a few occasions after that, after the election, after the new government had been formed.
Thank you. Well, it was clearly very influential, and academic work is judged on its impact, and certainly it had some. But Mr. Cummings, when he gave evidence to the committee on this, and subsequently Sir John Kingman in a lecture that he gave to mark the end of his tenure as chair of UKRI, both gave a warning that there was a high likelihood that these commitments would be gnawed away at by people in government, official and political, that may not have the same commitment and zeal that Mr. Cummings had and you from the outside have. And therefore, the curious evaporation, as you put it, of the date against the 22 billion commitment, one perhaps should see as a sign of that. Do you share those concerns?
Well, I certainly share those concerns. I mean, I don't feel in a position to judge whether the depth of commitment in the government. I mean, what I would say is, there are always, I can see the tensions between short-term imperatives and long-term imperatives. Levelling up is a long-term project. Net zero is a long-term project, though it needs to get going quite quickly to be able to get there. So I mean, the only comment I would make is to stress, I think that the government will find it difficult to achieve its stated long-term goals without following through on that promise of increased R&D funding. Again, I think, coming back to, if levelling up, I mean, I really think levelling up should mean the long-term project of raising the productivity and economic performance of our big cities outside London, of our towns, of the urban hinterlands. We want to see higher productivity that then translates into higher wages, tangible improvements in people's living standards. If we are going to get to net zero, we have to really retool the entire energy system of the UK over quite a short period. That needs innovation to get the cost down, so that's not going to be a politically difficult imposition of costs on ordinary people. We have a health service that's under huge strain, social care system that's under huge strain. again, we need innovation to solve those problems. So, you know, I wouldn't, you know, I am a scientist, so you could kind of caricature this as being me wanting more money for my sector, but I genuinely believe that this is really about the big goals that the government has. And as I say, I appreciate that the short-term pressures are on it, but if it wants to deliver levelling up, net zero, global Britain, getting our companies producing goods that we can trade across the world, these are things that need that R&D intensity to go up to 2.4%, and R&D intensity won't go up to 2.4% unless we see that pump priming investment from the public sector.
Thank you very much indeed. So
If I may quickly
Professor
add
yes.
something, in looking at it from the scientific community, it was ever thus. I mean, for example, the Blair government had a 10-year plan which included a significant GDP rise, R&D over GDP rise, and we never got to the 10 years. I mean, we improved, but we didn't get there. The European Commission had something called the Lisbon Target, dating from the early 2000s for 3%, and I think has hardly moved, although some of the leading countries have substantially moved, which is the problem we were talking about earlier.
Well, that's a very helpful historical warning. Let's see if we can break the trend. I'm going to turn to Erin Bell and then Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for having us and for giving evidence. I know my colleagues want to get into specifics, but I just want to do a little bit more on these targets, the 2.4%, the 22 billion. Professor Jones, you said earlier we have a ratio of about 2 to 1 private to public. It seems to be a bit better in the Northwest. Is 2 to 1 really what we should be aiming for in the long term? The countries that are truly successful get a lot more private investment in, and how can, as we put more public money in, whenever we get to that date, and we'll come to that in a moment, how can we get that ratio up from 2 to more like the sort of 3 or 4 you see in countries like Japan and South Korea?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think I may have to defer to Professor Giorgio on that because it's proper innovation studies stuff. I think the structure of the economies in Korea and in Japan looks very different to the structure of our economy. They're much more closed. One has the conglomerates that are kind of closely linked together. You have very kind of close coupling between those companies and the government. If you read what people are saying, well, China, of course, is in the same category, only more so. So there is this East Asian development model that involves a very close coupling between the government and a bunch of really big national champions that are very technologically intensive. Our economy is much more open. The R&D intensive parts of our industry are very often overseas owned. It's a very big question about whether you think we ought to completely transform our economic model to something that looks more like the model of Taiwan or Korea and Japan. And actually, I think we ought to spend more time looking at those examples because they're very successful economies. But, that's a big change. I mean, 2 to 1 is something that economies that roughly look like ours, France, Germany, the USA to some extent, seem to have that lower ratio. That higher ratio seems to be associated with an East Asian developmental state model.
Okay, I'll come to Professor Giorgio in a second on the same question, but just before that, if we get this 22 billion by 24-25, would you expect the private sector investment in this country to move in lockstep in that 2 to 1 ratio, or will there be a lag?
I think there will be a lag, but I think 22 billion by 2024-5 was actually about right for 2.4 by 2027. I mean, it's all a bit. I mean, the other thing about 2.4%, it's 2.4% of GDP, and we don't know what GDP is going to be in 2027. I hope it's going to be. I hope that the target will be more stretching because our economy will recover quicker than some people fear, but who knows?
Professor Giorgio, you wanted to comment on the first question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, going back to that, I think those Asian economies reach those ratios because at a time when they were largely in catch-up mode. R&D covers a wide range of activities, and this was very heavily development funding, the last stages of bringing products to market. What we have seen is that most of those economies are now working as hard as possible to, having reached the frontier, to fill in their more fundamental science bases. And we've seen a rocketing increase in China, particularly in their investment in science. Yeah.
Thank you. And just both of you, before I hand over to my colleagues, apart from the targets we've already spoken about, are there any other R&D commitments you'd like to see in the forthcoming spending review and the budget?
Just to bang on, to say this again, I think net zero is a really, it's something that we have to do. I think it's a harder task than many policymakers currently appreciate. I think it needs a lot of R&D to support, as low carbon technology is implemented, that needs to be supported by R&D, as I say, to drive the costs down and to increase the scale.
Thank you. Professor Jordan?
Well, I wouldn't like to leave this topic of investment with the impression that there's some sort of sausage machine. You put in
Yes.
public R&D money, private R&D, and innovation comes out. The countries are differential in how well they do out of this, and it really does depend on getting all the surrounding conditions right and investing in a number of complementary activities, including skills, for example. Yeah.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you very much. Dawn Butler, then back to Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both very much for your evidence today. I just want to touch on something very quickly. Professor Jones, you mentioned energy, and as it's quite topical at the moment, I just wondered what kind of innovations do you think's needed in the energy market at the moment?
I think there's a very wide range of innovations. I mean, we see big emphasis. I mean, if we step back and think, what do we use energy for? We use it for transport. We use it for electricity, domestic electricity and industrial electricity. We use it for domestic heating, which is a very large part of it that's not always understood. Each of those we need to think about individually. So there's a big focus on transport. So we have electric cars and lots of R&D support for that. That's as it should be. That's good, though it's a very competitive world market, and we need to understand what our position is in that market. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen at the moment. Hydrogen, of course, is an energy vector rather than a source of energy. So we have to think about how do we actually make hydrogen in a way that doesn't produce carbon dioxide. Then uses for that in terms of decarbonising industry. So, it's an astonishing story that we're seeing at the moment about carbon dioxide because people can't make fertilisers. Making fertiliser is a fairly classic piece of heavy process engineering that needs a lot of energy. So we need to think about how we can use hydrogen to decarbonise those industrial sectors. We need to work out how we can get our housing to be much more energy efficient, how we can heat our houses. I think that's actually a very big area for innovation. I think if we're a big program of social housing and new housing, building new housing ought to be coupled with innovations in making housing more energy efficient. So yes, I could go on for it's a short question. I could go on for a long time. But I mean, energy is so important throughout our economy, and the changes that we have to make are so far-reaching that there's just a huge number of innovations that will be needed.
Thank you. And do you think, just going back to the question that Catherine and the Chair asked you, do you think that ARIA should play a role in that too, seeing as it's going to sort of operate on sort of a bigger level, looking at all of the upcoming forward-thinking technology and R&D in energy, say?
I think the energy problem is bigger than ARIA as it's currently set up can do. I think there is maybe I'll anticipate what Professor Georgie will say. I mean, there's a huge role here for the government in driving innovation, both through regulation and through its role as a customer. And so, as cities and regions engage in programs of social housing, they should be using that as an opportunity to develop new technologies, new ways of retrofitting housing to make them more energy efficient. So I think ARIA could be a part of the picture, but it can't be all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Georgia, obviously the pandemic, lots of organisations and scientists, fields have been working together. Do you think that this post-COVID situation leads to any particular opportunities for sort of economic growth driven by sort of research and innovation and technology?
Bayes' innovation strategy refers to what they call a Sputnik moment, that the public have realised the benefits of scientific innovation as a result of seeing the vaccines come through, for example. So there is something to be taken advantage of. But the other side of that is that we're also carrying major setbacks from the pandemic period, and the experience from past recessions has shown that business R&D spend, particularly on SMEs, will fall back considerably, probably in the coming immediate years. So unless we take measures to remedy that, we'll not be in a good position to take advantage as we come out. However, there is, as one who follows the great economist Schumpeter, often important new waves of innovation do come out of crises. And this is possibly the time that we can make some significant shifts in the energy market, as my colleague was saying. Green technology would be a very good example. And by the way, I'm very surprised, Professor Jones, that you didn't mention the nuclear sector in that list too.
Earlier today, we were talking to people, and they mentioned CTDA, the coronavirus test device approvals. Do you know much about that, and will that affect? Will that have an effect on sort of research development and moving forward in science and field?
No specific knowledge, I'm afraid. Okay. Other than the point Professor Jones already made, that the regulatory environment is a major area of competition between countries, and if we can make it pro-innovation, that would be beneficial.
Does pro-innovation mean less hurdles, sort of less red tape?
Well, yeah. Nobody would ever say more red tape, would they, in an answer. I think a greater opportunity to experiment under controlled conditions, a kind of sandbox approach, rather than abandoning necessary precautions. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Professor Jones?
Yes, thank you. Allow me to place on record the fact that I think that there's a huge research agenda. I think nuclear new build is really important. A huge amount of our current low-carbon electricity generation capacity comes from a fleet of very aging AGR reactors that will be coming offline over the next 10 years. I find it difficult to believe that we can meet a net zero target without a substantial programme of nuclear new build, and we need to drive the costs of that down. I mean, it's clear that that currently the nuclear programme is not without its difficulties. That needs innovation, things like small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors that could co-produce hydrogen. There's a whole range of technological innovations that we need to be getting our skates on a bit with, I think. Yes, and of course, nuclear allows me to talk about regulation too. I mean, it would be mad to have an unregulated nuclear new build programme. New technologies need to be safe. They need to be accepted widely by the public, and sensible, well thought through regulation can give people confidence in that and can give us a competitive advantage.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Graham Stringer and then Chris Clarkson.
When it comes to trying to hit the government's net zero target, isn't there a case for putting our skates in the wardrobe rather than putting them on? Because there are real risks involved in being first, aren't there? If some other country, somebody else makes a big innovation in improving the efficiency of batteries or small nuclear reactors, one can go through a whole series, and if we've gone down one road which isn't as good, it may be that we're saddled with very high costs when there is better technology there. There are some times when it is better to be second or third to benefit from innovation elsewhere. Is it not?
Yeah, we see an example with that in solar. I mean, the costs of solar have plummeted. The costs of solar have largely plummeted because the Chinese government has given their factories free capital. It's a difficult issue. We have to. We account for a few percent of the world's GDP, so we won't lead in every technology. That's why we need to be quite discriminating about what are the technologies that we think we actually can make a contribution to and benefit from. So yeah, I'm not calling for indiscriminate R&D across the entire picture, because we have to, we will buy lots of things. We're part of global supply chains.
It does mean there are potentially very expensive risks involved. And I noticed one of the priorities that hasn't been given, where there are reports from California, France, Oxford, that there have been breakthroughs in fusion recently. Do you think that Manchester and North West, the country as a whole, should be looking more closely at fusion? Because if there really is a breakthrough in fusion, that does alter the whole structure of the energy market over the next 30 or 40 years.
I think the UK actually has a genuinely significant position in fusion. So having hosted JET for some years, Culham is a very impressive laboratory, and as you know, it is attracting private sector funding. However, I'm still, I think it would be very unwise to believe that fusion is something that we can, we should do fusion in case it works. I don't think that it would be at all wise to rely on fusion to get us to a 2050 target.
That wasn't quite the question I was asking, relying on it, whether we should be putting more eggs, not all our eggs.
I think we're putting quite a few. I think we're putting quite a few eggs in it. I think, if I think back to when I was on council of EPSRC, the fusion grant was actually pretty much the biggest single grant that we gave out. So I think we have focused a lot on fusion. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. We should think about, I think the other thing that we should think about is, are we maximising the spillovers from our fusion investment? Do we get the benefit from it, even if it doesn't pan out the way we hope? Will we be able to use the capability that that's given us in other sectors? You can see where those areas are. Very advanced robotics happening in Culham, very advanced materials science. Actually some of the similar advanced materials science that we'll need to do, for example, is do a high temperature advanced modular reactor. And that's the sort of thing. And since we are in Manchester, I have to mention that, those are things that are being studied right now in the Royce Institute about, the behaviour of materials in extreme environments. Those are going to be the limiting factors for fusion. If we can crack those problems, we can use those in other areas too.
Just to pick up on the Northwest dimension as well, I think this region would be very well placed to host the present test facility that's being talked about with either in Cumbria or in Cheshire, with support from all of the rest of the region in the necessary skills. But that is an open competition. But
it isn't an open competition.
Well, it is a competition, and I hope we will be in that competition.
The university are lobbying hard.
Well, we don't think it could possibly be in Manchester, so we're neutral in that sense, but we have said we will support anyone who puts a credible bid in from the Northwest with our technological capabilities.
Right, and just a final question. It comes back to the first question. It's another way of asking the first series of questions. If you were to say what the benefits were simply of devolving R&D spending to the regions, how would you summarise that? I'd like to put that in the report.
Yes, the benefits really come about from having local knowledge. So in order to build, what we want to do is to build an innovation ecosystem to support existing innovators. So we want to find out who if we're talking about a city like Greater Manchester, we've got a structure for doing this in Innovation GM, which is a collaboration between the private sector, the universities and the combined authority. What we can do at a city level is understand who at the moment is doing that innovating and find out what are the barriers that are stopping them do more of it. Those barriers could be access to facilities, could be about skills, very often will be about skills. Those are things that we can find out, that we can have knowledge about locally. I think it's very much more difficult to imagine being in Victoria Street or in Victoria Embankment or even Swindon and saying, well, we understand the needs in the technical textiles sector in northeast Manchester. This is what needs to happen to support them. That, I think we just need to be closer to the action to be able to make those decisions. So I think that the argument for devolution or co-creation, because I think we should work with central government agencies on doing this, is the extra knowledge that we can bring to bear on it. We can then combine that with the other capabilities that local government can have. So if we're creating new facilities, we can integrate that with what we're doing about transport. We can integrate that with what we're doing about skills. We can get the universities and FE colleges to work together to make sure that the skills are in place for the more innovative economy that we hope would emerge from our R&D efforts. So I'd see that's how I'd summarise it. Local knowledge, an ability to integrate it with the other functions of local government.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. Just on that, when we talk about devolution of funds, what we usually mean is taking funds that are currently held centrally or nationally and putting them in the hands of local people. So does that mean, going back to our earlier conversation in which you said it was the increase in science funding that gave the opportunity to have new money being more local? That's a bit different from devolution, which is about existing funds. You've been a member of the council of the EPRSC, the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council. Are you saying that some of the Research Council budgets ought to be devolved and, for the reasons you very eloquently said, might be better allocated locally?
I think I would focus on devolution of additional funds. So if there are additional funds that were being ring-fenced for the purpose of levelling up, if you like, I think those are funds that should be devolved. I come back to this co-creation word, though. I think it would be very helpful. I think absolutely competent bodies in cities and regions should be working in partnership with research councils. So in the same way as EPSRC will work in partnership with a large company, they will inform their strategy. I see no reason why EPSRC shouldn't consider Greater Manchester to be a partner in the same way that Rolls-Royce or JLR might be. likewise with Innovate UK. So I think this is going to happen in a number of different ways. I think new money. I think there is the case for new money being devolved. I think there's also there's a burden on cities. Cities need to be able to demonstrate that they have the capacity to make good decisions, that they've got the networks in place, that they are connected in the way that they say to their local business communities. So I think, it's a two-way business. It's a deal that's got two sides, if you like. So that new money can be handled in that way, but then I think there's a scope for wider partnership working across other agencies of government. And then, we talk about the research councils, and we mustn't forget that government departments spend significant amounts of money on R&D. The R&D budget of the Department of Health and Social Care is very large, and arguably perhaps ought to be more in touch with other regions than London and the South East. Ministry of Defence, of course, has a large budget, and with the slightly more uncertain world we're living in, the way that money is spent could involve regional involvement too.
And finally, on this point, in some ways, if the policy is devolution, then government departments can be directed to follow that. As Mr. Stringer referred to in his earlier question, the Haldane principle provides a bit of distance between the research councils and government. From your experience as an academic and having served on the council of a research council, do you think research councils would be up for that kind of regional collaboration, as can happen, as you rightly say, with some private companies?
I mean, it'd be wrong for me to comment. I'm not involved in the research councils at the moment. I think, I think quite highly of the research councils. I think they're creative and innovative bodies, and I think, to go back to the Haldane principle, nothing in the Haldane principle says that the government shouldn't set strategic priorities as they do with net zero. If a strategic priority of the government is levelling up, I think it's fine for them to challenge the research councils with ways in which they could contribute to that agenda, and I think they will come up with creative and experimental ways of doing that. And so I would put it in those terms. But again, the Haldane principle applies to the research councils. Government spending on R&D is much bigger than the research councils. I mean, historically it's been very much bigger. Now the research councils are quite a large bit of it. But I think, getting to 22 billion, that's not going to be all going through the research councils. And so we need to think about all those other ways in which the government is spending R&D money, rightly in pursuit of its big strategic goals.
Thank you very much. Chris Clarkson, then finally Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to pick up on the local theme. As you've probably guessed, I'm also a Greater Manchester MP. There's plenty of us on the panel. But I'd like to turn specifically to the pandemic, and I'd like to understand from your perspective how research in the region has been affected by the pandemic, whether certain settings were more affected than others, and how long-lasting you think some of those effects have been. And if I could start with Professor Jones, then go to Professor Giorgio.
Yeah, I mean, we can answer this question at a number of levels. I mean, at a very practical level, it's been as disruptive to the day-to-day business of researchers as it's been to everyone else. And that it's slowed down research. It's made it difficult to collaborate. It's made it difficult to kind of just practically to get into the lab and do things. I think companies have found it difficult, and as Professor Giorgio said, I mean, any recession of any kind tends to lead to a reduction in the R&D capacity of companies, because a company fighting for survival, it has to prioritise getting through the crisis over the long term. So I think those are kind of those are the immediate effects. I think on the other hand, I mean, there has been a slight Schumpeterian aspect to this, in the sense that I think we've seen it in particularly in healthcare and in health research, that has produced big changes, both in the way that health services operate. It's been a bigger impetus to digitalisation of healthcare than anything we've seen for some time. And we've seen very impressive, fast progress in vaccines and therapeutics and so on. So it's affected it in both ways. I mean, it's been an enormously disruptive and difficult period, as it has been for everyone, but it's shaken things up.
Do you think that shift in focus is going to be long-lasting, or do you think things will sort of naturally sort of default back to a wider mix of research areas?
Well, I think it should be long-lasting. I mean, I think, in a case, in a sense, it's a little bit early to tell. I think, when the dust settles, we should be looking at, what our life sciences sector did well and where there were gaps. I think, we've learned things like, the importance of diagnostics that perhaps we didn't take seriously enough. Or even vaccines. I mean, we didn't have a very big vaccine manufacturing capacity 2 years ago. That's been something that's developed very fast, and that's been, a positive thing. So we will, we need to make sure that we learn those lessons, and things perhaps might be a little bit different. And I'd say, come back to public health. I mean, the looking at the inequalities of the impact of the pandemic across our communities and the way that maps onto economic inequality, that reminds us, just to go back. We have had very unequal health outcomes both across the whole country and within the country. That health outcomes in your bit of Greater Manchester are much worse than health outcomes in the southwest of Greater Manchester. And that, to me, seems something that we've probably tolerated too long, and maybe the pandemic has shone a light on that and will make us do something about it.
Fair point.
If I may add to that, on the effects here, in practical terms, during the first lockdown, we had to stop all on-site research other than that which was COVID related. So we had quite a strict filter on that, but there was quite a large amount of work going on COVID related activity with good results. After that, distancing meant that labs had to operate at substantially reduced capacity, and talking to companies, their capacities were about the same, perhaps 25%. So there are effects, and they'll be felt for some time in terms of outputs and timing of outputs. But the point I wanted to add was possibly true in other things as well, that the effects are differential on people who are early in their careers. They have missed out key development stages, key opportunities to establish themselves and make contacts and so forth. And if we want to take any remedial measures, we should concentrate on these people. Otherwise, we'll have a harmed generation coming through the crisis.
I'm glad you picked up on that, Professor. So what is being done at the moment to try and support those people and research in general? And let's pretend that I'm the government for a second. If you had key asks, what would they be?
I'm sure they would their representatives would make requests for themselves. I mean, an early issue was to ensure that their financial support was extended so that they could finish, for example, doctorates if they were at that level, or that projects could be extended. Now, UKRI did make substantial efforts. Not all funders did. Wellcome were very good in this respect, and were leaders. So we probably need to assess where we are now as we come out of the pandemic. But it could be interesting, for example, to have a programme of starter grants for people who've been affected by this. It wouldn't be as expensive as some other things in the world of research, but give these people some space to re-establish their careers. Yeah.
And is there anything you'd like to ask Professor Jones?
No, yes, I mean, as a scientist who runs a research group, it's been, the toll it's taken on researchers is apparent, and things that we can do practically to support them as they start out on their careers, I think, are very valuable.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And finally, Catherine Fletcher.
I just wanted to return to one of the topics we were talking about here, and perhaps to start with Professor Georgie. As proud Northwesterners, not quite all, due colleague to my left accepted, but we know our region's got lots of strengths. We've already highlighted health and innovation. We've already highlighted nuclear. What strengths would you highlight that could be targets for improved focus on R&D pounds from the public purse? Perhaps if I started with you, Professor Georgie.
Well, in a sense, at least for our immediate region of Greater Manchester, we've put in a lot of groundwork to identify where those strengths are, beginning with the science and innovation audit and following on with a number of other detailed studies. So we have identified health innovation, as we've already mentioned, partly building on the devolved health system in this city. But in particular, and very important for our university, advanced materials is a clear comparative advantage, and how that plays into the business sector is very important for us. There's a very strong digital and creative sector, Media City being one focus of that, but there is more than that. And then we also are trying to align as much as possible with the city's more ambitious target on clean growth and net zero, the 2038 target. So that's a short list. There are others.
Yeah. I mean, it's just capabilities all over the place. I'll tell you what I'm interested in is the kind of translation of that into commercial research, because ultimately, we level up by paying our way, by kind of creating, the next Rolls-Royce meeting in the New Midland Hotel type, if you're going to go classic about it. So the government's produced this innovation strategy in July, which is about paving the path to that. I mean, do you think there's enough support for the commercialisation? I know we're a step ahead of the pure R&D that we've been talking about, and we'll focus it on the next panel, but I'd love to make sure we link the two.
Okay, well, let's begin with commercialisation coming out of universities. There was a clear deficit, well, not just in this region, in the north of England, in terms of available and targeted investment for spin-out companies. Some of them emerging from the building we're sitting in now. I mean, essentially the Golden Triangle spin-outs were getting probably 50 times as much investment, even though we produce as many as they do. So we address these ourselves with good catalytic support from Research England and UK RI. We went to them with a proposal to found the Northern Gritstone Investment Company, as it's now called. It was called Northern Triangle originally. And this is a spin-out fund targeted to the outputs of 3 universities, the University of Manchester, University of Leeds, and University of Sheffield. If you add us up, it gives us a substantially bigger collective research income than any other university in the country. 11,000 academics, 33,000 doctoral researchers. So there's a big potential of innovative activity to invest in. We account for about 10% of patents coming out of universities. Now, this company has been formed. We will only have very small shares in it, but we've signed up agreements that we will pass our intellectual property activities through it with a guarantee of investment. And it's aiming to raise 200 million round about the end of this year, and a cap of about 500 million. That will absolutely transform that landscape. So.
And if I may add, a fabulous room to expand, quality people and a lovely view. I just wanted to return to the government's innovation strategy, though, and how that ties in with wonderful kind of locally led initiatives like Northern Gritstone. Is there anything more that the government needs to do? Is it put more flesh on the bones? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I am interested in it, seeing it's so recently released. Or perhaps if Professor Jones was coming.
Well, I'll start quickly, because I do think we actually have quite a good set of innovation policy instruments in this country. I mean, things like knowledge transfer partnerships are imitated in many countries. So it's not lack of good people and good ideas. The question would be the scale of these things. Do they exist to match the challenge? I mean, knowledge transfer partnerships, for example, they will put somebody under academic supervision into a company, often an SME, and allow them to develop a very practical innovation. The problem is just the total number of them, and actually more here than anywhere else, but the total number doesn't match the number of innovative companies that this country needs. So it's a population issue. Not that companies don't do enough innovation, but we don't have enough companies that to do innovation, if you can see that distinction.
Yeah. Professor Jones, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this question of translational research is very important. You know, we've seen, I mean, I mentioned the Strength in Places Fund before. One of the successes of the Strength in Places Fund was the Advanced Machinery and Productivity Institute, which is being built in Rochdale. You know, what's characteristic of that? You know, that's very much driven by local businesses that have then brought in the support of the National Physical Laboratory as a kind of major government research institution, and local universities, including the University of Manchester. So I think that's an example. I think the catapult centres have been successful. So in my previous life, I was in Sheffield, and the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, I think, was very effective at driving up productivity in the regional company base. I would like to see, you know, we haven't got a catapult centre in Greater Manchester, and I think we ought to have one, and I think it should be, you know, we need to follow where the industry is. I mean, a characteristic of Greater Manchester's economy, not, you know, Lancashire too, is it's very heavily driven by SMEs. So we need to think about how do we support SMEs in their innovation activities. We have the Made Smarter scheme, which I think has been a great success. So that's one good thing. So I think we can expand that. And, you know, I would like to see a catapult centre focused on advanced materials, because that's a sector that I think is really important, both for our regional economy and in terms of the academic support we can give. So, you know, I would like to see a catapult centre for materials for sustainable manufacturing, and I'd like it to see it not on the Oxford Road, but somewhere up more in Chris's end. Yeah, I think, you know, that's where the centre of mass of the industry is. Yeah. So we need to look, where is the industry, where's the need? That's where we need to put those translational research centres.
I know I would forgive me for interrupting, but I was point out Springfield's nuclear is a wonderful site up on the other side of Preston, been over that centre of expertise, but that's me being cheeky. Sorry,
and
Chair.
There's a very nice space in State Hill in Middleton.
Okay, Northern Pride overcomes us. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Sorry, Chair.
There's one gap in our policies, which I know we both think, because we've been talking about research and innovation, but there's also the diffusion of technology. So the acquisition of technology by existing companies, and it's tended to be a gap in this country for as long as I can remember. It's never been the primary mission of any agency. I think in decades past, the old Department of Trade and Industry used to run consulting support schemes and things.
I'm very conscious that the Chair wants us to stop. Would it be possible for you to write to the committee with maybe just a brief outline of that diffusion view, so that we can take into account with our evidence? Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you,
and I think Made Smarter is a good example of something that does address that, but it's, you know, it needs expanding and scaling up. Sorry.
I can just see the Science and Technology Committee becoming an estate agency, with people giving attractive descriptions of the properties in their constituencies. All very justified. I'm very grateful to our two witnesses who are professors of this university. We're very grateful to be here. And if I may say so, I think the excellence of the research in this university and others across the North, and the writings of our witnesses today, have driven the fact that we are talking about increases in investment in what is a profoundly successful sector, and we're talking about the importance of regions and how they can contribute further to that. So for that, the heritage of your work, and for bringing us up to date in our inquiry, thank you very much indeed. We're now going to turn seamlessly to our next panel of witnesses, which will require me to introduce them as they take their seats. But I'm very pleased to welcome three witnesses who can talk to some of the commercial and industrial opportunities that there are for both recovering from COVID and, in general, prospering over the years ahead. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Chris Oglesby. Chris Oglesby is the Executive Chair of Bruntwood SciTech and the Chief Executive of Bruntwood, which is a company that has developed and made available investments across the country with a particular expertise in science parks and estates in which spin-offs from university research can take root and prosper. Very pleased to welcome Simon Cohen, who's the Chief Executive of Innovate Pharmaceuticals, and Richard Jeffrey, who is the National Director of an economic development business, GC Business. Thank you very much indeed for coming to join us here today. Perhaps I can start with a question to Chris Oglesby before I go to Chris Clarkson. And thinking of the development and the future development of economic opportunities here in the North West and Greater Manchester in particular, would you say a little about the role of the Greater Manchester combination of authorities and the arrangements, the working arrangements that have come together over the years? And perhaps you might make mention of the local industrial strategy, which has recently been put forward by the Greater Manchester partners.
Yes, thanks very much. And I think it's important that you highlight, Greg, that where we are today in Greater Manchester has a sort of a long thread of history through an evolving strategy. The local industrial strategy that you mention highlighted 4 areas which the previous 2 witnesses talked about, those of health innovation, advanced manufacturing and materials, clean growth and digital, as being 4 sectors that we see as not only driving the growth of the economy of Greater Manchester through the strengths in those sectors, but also the adoption of those sectors by companies, going back to the final point where you left the last discussion in terms of diffusion, in that we're seeing that it's those companies that are adopting digital, that are adopting clean growth, etc., that are actually disrupting their sectors and really driving the economy as well. But the local industrial strategies span out of the Manchester Independent Economic Review, and you can go backwards and backwards over a period of time as to how this is built up. And then the local industrial strategy, which was developed by the Local Enterprise Partnership, has now pulled together a proposal called Innovation Greater Manchester, which really looks forward in terms of how do we basically develop the well-advanced innovation ecosystem in Greater Manchester to enable the businesses and people of Greater Manchester to properly thrive through the adoption of innovation and research and development. And we'd ideally like to agree a place-based innovation deal with government, which has some form, whether it's pure devolution or whether it's a partnership, remains to be seen, so that we can have a place-based approach that really allows government to have the maximum impact on the people and business in Greater Manchester and the wider North West, bridging the gap and levelling up both north-south nationally, but also levelling up across the north as well, using the assets at the centre of Manchester and Salford, where we've got these sort of developed innovation assets, but really spreading the benefit of those assets more widely across Greater Manchester as well. So we've got a great history of working in collaboration within Greater Manchester, bringing together academia, local government and industry. And I think we've got a strong track record as well of collaboration with government in terms of helping government to deliver its national priorities through Greater Manchester as well, which comes back to that culture of collaboration that's at the heart of the city.
Thank you very much indeed. Chris Clarkson, I will turn to next, and then to Graham Strigger.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for coming to see us today, gentlemen. Chris, you've actually really started already asking the question I wanted to ask, which is sort of what local opportunities are there for research and innovation to drive the recovery in our region? And so, Chris, if you want to sort of start, we've already sort of really begun the thread, and then if either of the other two witnesses want to come in.
I mean, I think it's absolutely massive what the crisis has done. Is it's really accelerated what we were seeing before in terms of this sort of the upcoming fourth industrial revolution. And in many ways, this part of the world was still trying to deal with the fallout of the deindustrialization. And there are lots of lessons that we've learned from that in terms of how we're then going to prepare for going through this fourth industrial revolution. And what we're seeing coming out of the downturn is this K-shaped recovery, where those sectors, or as I said before, those businesses that are adopting those disruptive strengths are really thriving, and those that aren't are in decline. And what we need to do is to create the environment around those businesses that are thriving to allow them to do so. And the starkest fact at the moment, which we're seeing in Manchester, I think it's played out nationally, is the scale of current vacancies that we have at a time where we've also got challenges around unemployment. And the secret there clearly is to get the people out of work at the moment skilled for these new jobs that we're creating. Because the reality is that in this part of the world, having spent 30 years trying to create jobs post our deindustrialization, the biggest challenge now is we're creating more jobs than we can fill, and it's about then upskilling people for those jobs that we're creating.
Completely agree with that. That's basically the problem in my patch at the moment. Richard.
So in terms of those opportunities, I think they are huge, because what we've seen working with thousands of businesses over the last 10 years, and particularly in the last year, is just how much innovation has actually accelerated. And I take quite a broad view of what innovation means in terms of innovation systems, processes, people, leadership, throughout the whole business. And they've had to adapt, and they've realised that they can adapt. So I think we've got a real opportunity right now to capture that, to build on it, and really then celebrate those businesses that are doing it and show it can be done. And right now up the road, we've got over 3,000 people gathering at Progress 21, where we're bringing together a whole raft of people to celebrate those successes and celebrate where that sits. So we've discussed at length the sectors, and I agree with all of that, but that's what we see coming through. I think our challenge is to make sure that more businesses from that long tail of businesses are part of that innovation ecosystem, and we open it up so that people from a broad variety of backgrounds, a range of areas, feel they've got access. And I think that's where Innovate GM and the proposals really come to the fore, because it's not just focused on the centre of the city, it's about creating those opportunities and those nodes, those innovation centres across the whole of Greater Manchester. And I think that's really, really critical that we get that in place and build that ecosystem now to make sure we capture on the innovation that's been taking place over the last year.
Thank you. And Simon?
Yes, for us looking at the medical and health side of things, we have amazing facilities around Manchester and around the northwest. And it's about bringing them all together. So the universities, the NHS, and small companies such as ours working together to feed that innovation through, from early innovation all the way through to medicines that can be used by the public and by the NHS. And it's about joining that system together locally that's going to show real innovation, real move forward in the future.
So picking up on those innovations, and it's to all three members, what innovations have you come up with during this crisis? Just interested to see what you've been up to.
So they talk about disruptive, and we talk about changing paradigms, and that's what we've tried to do. So what we've tried to do is look at an area which is repurposed medicine. Now, during this crisis and during this COVID-19 pandemic, repurposed medicines started to come to the fore. Whereas before they were really the poor man of medicine. What do we do with some actives that we know work, but what do we do in the future? So what we've done is look at a way to bring repurposed medicines to the fore, to look at how we can make them more effective in different disease areas. And importantly, look at the end point, which we haven't tended to be very good at in this country, which is the commercialisation of those, and looking what incentives we need to go and bring these new medicines to market in effect. The problem has been in the past, of course, is that because they're already patented and the patents have run out, there's very little commercial push to spend 10 or 20 million pounds to bring them to market when everyone can copy them. So it's looking at how we can change that. And by enhancing them and by reformulating them, we've managed to repatent them and therefore make them a commercial prospect.
Chris?
I mean, our business is much about enabling our customer base, the science and technology businesses, to innovate, and you met a few of those this morning, and I think have seen just how nimble they've been. In our organisation, we developed out one of the lighthouse laboratories within 3 weeks to respond to the requirement there at the early stages of the pandemic, and turned a conference centre into a mass testing facility. And the ability to be able to move quickly and develop these kind of facilities with a client in the public sector on the other side that for once was able to move very quickly as well is something that we would love to be able to replicate as we're starting to respond to some of the big challenges going forward. But the biggest area of innovation has just been in the customer proposition and the flexibility that we're able to offer, whether that be, and the thing that our customers need from us is primarily at the moment, they're telling us, is access to finance, access to skills and access to the network, and working in collaboration with partners around Greater Manchester being able to provide those facilities for those customers.
So would you say it's fair to say that that's been your support to these businesses has been, that's the innovation?
That's the innovation particularly and recognising, and this is, I mean, again, going back to one of the big challenges that we've got at the moment. We talked about skills, but it is also innovation driven by these innovation districts that we're developing, generally regarded as being driven by proximity density and this culture of collaboration. It's these clusters. And it's always an easy give when we're looking at the priorities in terms of lockdown in the government, that work from home is always the first one that we can put in place because nobody's particularly going to vote down work from home. And yet the cost of that in terms of what the impact that it's had on innovation is very, very significant. And these clusters that we've got created where people are colliding together, we need to get people out again. We need to get people working collaboratively together. So I would make the case very strongly that when we're thinking about how we limit the spread of the virus, that we're thinking truly about the economic cost of work from home, because a lot of the things that have been done around here that have powered the economy forward are as a result of people working physically close together.
I completely agree. Richard?
So our business is all about engaging with other businesses, that face-to-face contact, encouraging people to change their behaviours, adopt innovation, etc. So when we said, right, you can't actually physically go and see any of these businesses, you know, we had a bit of a challenge there. But we very quickly pivoted all our services, and we did a number of real key things. So for the city, we created a mechanism to capture live data from businesses. So every business we spoke to, we asked the same set of questions. That was live. That became a situation report that actually was hugely helpful to all partners across the city. We brought all our partners together on a virtual but weekly basis to make sure all the business organisations, everybody was coming together to make sure we were sharing that intelligence. And we continued to innovate by bringing forward new services, albeit virtual, albeit in a slightly different way. And a really good couple of examples of perhaps the work that we did around global scale-up. So we have programs in place to help companies grow, scale, and get into global markets. And those innovation companies, obviously, prior to the pandemic, a lot of that global activity was done face-to-face, getting out there. But what we did is we joined partnership, as Greater Manchester always does, and we brought together key partners like KPMG, DWF, Santander, and others. And we came together and said, right, how can we solve this problem so we can continue to create those opportunities? And that programme was hugely successful. And we actually had more market-centred during the pandemic than we had before the pandemic in that, because we just found new routes to market and new ways to open that up. And there's one particular company that's been well publicised, the Insights family, deals with data and intelligence around young people. That company has expanded rapidly and entered multiple markets, having not necessarily been to those markets, but it's just found a way to do it because of the connections and connectivity. So we've constantly been innovating ourselves, but I've been really amazed and really inspired by how much the businesses we work with have adapted and been able to innovate. But I absolutely agree with Chris. It's important that to sustain and to build on that, we have more kind of actual contact. And that's why we've got things like Progress 21 taking place right now up the road. So.
Fantastic. It's just one last question, actually. This one's to Simon. So I just wanted to ask how Innovate Pharmaceuticals' experience would have differed without help from the Business Growth Hub.
It made a big difference to us, both that and the other funds that we were able to access. They were one of the few funds that we could access, actually. And what it made for us was a difference was to be able to work with other universities. So particularly the innovation voucher gave us the ability to put funds in and have some more funds available to do the work for us at specific universities on specific formulations. So it did make a big difference. The MapMed money allowed us to look at a very specific area of one of our drugs that's going to be used in COVID-19. The trial starts on the 4th of October in Louisiana. And without that money, it's doubtful whether we'd been able to do that trial at all. So it was very useful indeed.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to go to Graham Stringer and then Rebecca Long-Bailey.
That's all very positive, and I'm not surprised it's positive. But there must have been some challenges that it was impossible to overcome, particularly in relating research to economic growth. I don't want to be negative, but perhaps you can tell us the most difficult problems that haven't been overcome and how the areas you work in now are different than they were 2 years ago, and is that likely to remain? Start with you, Chris.
I think so when we talk about that K-shaped recovery, then it is thinking about those businesses and those parts of the economy that are in decline, and whether it's the right thing to do to look at interventions or not. And I still go back to the point I was making earlier, that for a large amount of those sectors, there are winners in those sectors who are the ones that are sort of effectively diffusing innovation, adopting new practices, policies that are allowing them to thrive. So for me, I still keep going back to the biggest single challenge is skills and ultimately the sort of leftover consequences of the challenges of the last 30 years in terms of the polarisation of outcomes of our population. And the only way that we're going to unlock the potential of the country is to unlock the potential of the whole population. The silver lining there for me is that when I started work in the early 90s, everything was about the corporate function, and it was all about your education, where you went to school, as to how you were to succeed. Now technology has completely democratised the workplace, and we're seeing businesses come and expand in Manchester because of the diversity of our population, as opposed to necessarily just purely its educational achievements to date. And therefore, for me, we really must be focused on now taking those people who to date have underachieved and finding ways to link them with these jobs, because the reality is that the jobs that we're creating, they are capable of doing. Whereas in the past, when you were landing new lawyers, accountants, bankers, or whatever in these cities, there was only a finite proportion of the population that realistically you were going to be able to get into those jobs at the time. So when I look at the challenges, they are those wider social challenges, which is why Innovation GM sits as part of the broader recovery strategy in GM, alongside the transport strategy, alongside the skills and education strategy. And it's thinking about the investment in people and place that sits alongside the investment in innovation that's so important, which is why I believe it needs to be a collaborative approach between place and central government, because if central government tries to do this on its own, landing this money with a real sniper fashion in a particular micro location, then it's probably going to fail because it doesn't necessarily have the rest of the infrastructure and ecosystem around it, if that makes sense, Graham.
It does, it makes a lot of sense. But is there anything that's particularly more difficult or worse after the last 2 years, or slightly less than 2 years of the pandemic? That's what I'm trying to get at. You've given a very positive problem-solving scenario. I just wonder what has got worse.
The biggest single thing for me has been the impact on the population of it, and going back to, I mean, we sort of bandy mental health per se around, but if we look at the work that we're doing more in our communities and the impact on those communities, and it goes back to the impact of isolation that has had such an impact in terms of then making people capable actually of being able to do the jobs that so there's the skills piece per se, but also there's actually the sort of resilience and everything else that's been hit as a result of this that we need to that I feel we need to work at. And as one of the previous witnesses said, it has exposed those health inequalities as well that we've got. So it's the sort of underlying social challenges for me that are the biggest single thing that are going to hold us back. The economy itself, we would like to see the investment in R&D and excellence in our region that we feel that that we're able to sort of multiply in a way. When you're talking about the multipliers earlier of 2 to 1, if you're putting investment behind business-led R&D, and again, the whole point of Innovation GM is that it is a business-led initiative, then I think the businesses working with academia will give you a much better return on your investment than in the way that it's been distributed in the past.
I don't know if Simon or Richard want to add anything.
Okay. I will come in on that. I think the question was what was more difficult during and what's more difficult now, I think. And so during it, look, it was a lot harder to sometimes get some of the collaborations going and motoring forward. There's some amazing firms out there like Simon, some amazing academics like Richard and colleagues, but trying to align that is challenging at the best of times, but it can be done, and the Growth Hub and others do that job. But I think during the pandemic, that was a bit harder just because of all the priorities that everybody had, and that's been touched on earlier. I think one of the challenges, yes, there's a challenge around the workforce and people getting access to these opportunities, but I think it's also worth just dwelling for a moment on some of the challenges of leading businesses and leading SMEs at the moment. We've had the huge challenge of guiding your business through COVID. You've come out of that, and now we're going to business saying, right, you've got to sort out your low carbon strategy as a business. Right, you've got to deal with the challenges of dealing with some of the cash flow changes. You've got to deal with your supply chain challenges. So you've got so many more demands on the leaders of those businesses, and at the same time saying, and you need to innovate more, and you need to adopt digital. So I think it's worth acknowledging the challenges in leadership of that. But that's why programs such as Made Smarter, and we were really pleased to deliver the pilot of Made Smarter in the northwest of England. That's been such a useful program because it's given people a roadmap. Because you go to a business and say, right, you've got to innovate, you've got to adopt digital. That's a big topic. There's lots of issues to deal with in that. And actually getting a roadmap and starting to work out, right, what digital technology is right for you? Who can you trust in that market? What are you really wanting to get out of it? And getting that roadmap in place, plus a bit of support to help you bring on those suppliers. That's really helpful. It just takes a pressure away from leadership and gives a pathway. And we've certainly seen a whole raft of companies beginning to adopt that. And it's been a very successful program that I really hope continues.
Thank you.
I mean, if I may give a specific example for our company, which was that we were very involved in a cancer trial that was going to start here in Manchester. In fact, we met just over there. with professors, with doctors, etc. And what happened in that case was that as COVID hit, all of those centres switched their attention to COVID, and that trial has been severely delayed. To answer the second part of your question, do we hope that will change? We certainly do, and we expect it to, and be able to get back to that cancer trial that is very important. The knock-on effect, of course, is to patients, and the delay in actually getting those medicines to market and into patients that has caused major problems, especially in the cancer market.
Thank you. Just last question, if I may. It's not... Well, one of the things that will change because of the pandemic is that there's a health and care bill wending its way through Parliament at the moment. I think all the evidence we've had is that the devolution deal for Greater Manchester has been very helpful in encouraging what was already a collaborative situation. It's not clear to me that that devolution, when the CCGs go, it's not clear to me that the devolution deal is completely safe. What would you say to government if that devolution deal was at risk?
I mean, from our point of view, I think there would be a huge missed opportunity in terms of R&D. I think one of the big benefits of the devolution deal is exactly that, in terms of innovation in health and the ability to be able to invest money in preventing people from getting ill in the first place. And so, and again, it goes back to that. The idea of place-based innovation deals, the idea that in place we're able to have a bigger impact working in collaboration with government, and we've seen huge innovations over since the adoption of the devolved health. So I think that would be a huge step backwards if it was taken.
I'll come in on that. We've touched on some of these things before. Trying to design an intervention and something in Whitehall that lands with a business in Bury or Bolton that solves all of their needs, it's really, really hard to do that. By devolving budgets, by devolving responsibility, you're able to take that place-based approach and get all elements of the ecosystem to work together. Now, we're a long way down that journey in Greater Manchester already, but and any setback on that would be a really big setback. And I think it's just about continuing that journey. Look, we've proved as a location that it can work here, and it can work really well here because it's building on solid foundations, and that's key. So I think that would be a really big setback for Greater Manchester, and indeed for other areas that look to this as a city, as a place where they can pick things up from, learn from, and get that broader adoption. So I think it would be a big setback, not just for Greater Manchester, but for other key cities across the north and beyond.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Rebecca Long-Bailey and then Catherine Fletcher.
Thanks very much. Firstly to Simon, I understand that Innovate UK have been developing something known as liquid aspirin. Could you give us a little bit more information about how that would have been in development before the pandemic and what sort of situations it would apply to, and how your thinking and research then changed?
Absolutely. Enhanced liquid aspirin is a product. Obviously, we look at repurposing. We look at taking well-known compounds so that we can get them to market much faster, but also to keep them affordable. One of the big problems we have worldwide is the cost of getting a new molecule to market, which is about 2 billion at the moment. And the cost knock-on to the NHS, where the budget needs to increase by 10% a year just to keep track of the new innovations and the new medicines out there. So we were looking to find something that sat in the affordable range. So enhanced liquid aspirin, we looked at the most widely used product in the world and developed that, and looked initially to develop it in repurposed areas such as cancer. And so the aim was that, as it is a significant improvement on aspirin as far as anti-inflammatory markers are concerned, that this would reduce inflammation, therefore improve cancers, etc., etc. And this is the way we drove the product and self-funded that all the way through until we had these trials, as we were talking about before. Unfortunately, what has happened is that there's been a significant slowdown in much of the research out there, except for COVID. It just so happened that enhanced liquid aspirin had 3 aspects to it that were specifically important for pandemic and specifically for COVID-19, which was it reduces viral load, which is pretty good in COVID. It reduces inflammation, which, considering that the cytokine storm is something that leads to hospitalization, and then blood clots and small blood clots that tend to be the main reason that people die in hospitals. And it affected all 3. So we changed our vision, our way we were going, not away from cancer, not away from cardiovascular disease, because they're still massively important, but we had to, because of the lack of any facilities to use outside of COVID, to look at that. So we've changed the direction for now. And as I say, we've looked to have a COVID trial. It would have been lovely to have it in this country, but it's going to be in the United States, and it's going to start on the 4th of October.
That's fantastic. I mean, that sounds absolutely groundbreaking. And I know that earlier on you sang the praises of the Growth Hub in Greater Manchester, which is fantastic. I think a lot of the North West MPs will all have positive stories about the Growth Hub and there not being anywhere else like it in the UK. But you also said that it was one of the few funds that you could access. Can you tell us the challenges that you faced trying to get this groundbreaking treatment off the ground?
Absolutely. The difficulty is that tag, repurposed medicine. As I said before, repurposed medicine has very little incentives from anyone. And the problem is if we develop something, let's say, I'll pick one, simvastatin, which is a drug that is now shown to be very useful in cancer. The problem is to spend 10 to 20 million pounds getting that to market when anyone can copy it from anywhere in the world. There's no incentive, no protection on it. And therefore, when you're looking for funds to back you, the minute you say it's repurposed, they say there's no commercial value to it. We can't commercialize it. Yes, it has great benefit to patients. Yes, it has great benefit in the NHS and further use. But really, can we make anything from it for the company? Where are we going to get our 10 or 20 million pounds back? And so what we looked at was changing that paradigm, just changing it through so we could repatent it and at least give it some protection. The problem is it's still seen as repurposed, and it's still seen as there's no incentives from central government, there's no incentives from anyone really, even though in the COVID pandemic, it was something that was mentioned all the time, repurposed drugs, repurposed drugs. But in order to develop them, the companies that are going to spend that money need to have some incentive. Now, the R&D tax benefits are phenomenally good. And I must commend whoever within government put those together, because they really have made a difference to us. And without them, we would not have survived. But more incentives for repurposing, more incentives for that type of innovation would be very, very useful.
And in terms of the government's antivirals task force, did you engage with them at all, and what was the response?
We tried, but again, this is the problem of being, I mean, we talk about SMEs, and you spoke about SMEs and some of the difficulties we have as an SME. We, in order to make our product affordable and keep it affordable, we made a business decision, which was that we would remain a micro company, and that we would engage with universities, not just in Manchester, but across the world, to act as third parties for us, to help us out, to keep the costs low, and to have world-class R&D. The problem with that is, as a micro company, we remain somewhat under the radar. And therefore, when you try to communicate with task force such as that, because they don't know you and because they don't know anyone on your board, that becomes very, very difficult. So yes, we did try and engage, but we didn't have any response back, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's disappointing, but thank you very much. That's very helpful. In terms of wider questions, I know, Chris, you mentioned about the skills gap earlier. How close would you say that our skills strategy in Greater Manchester, how closely aligned, should I say, is the skills strategy to our industrial strategy?
And we're working very hard as best we can with the levers that we've got locally, and there's working groups between FE, HE, the various providers get together on a regular basis to talk, and what we're now looking to do through Innovation Manchester is effectively to create a funnel where what we're able to do is to aggregate industry's requirements and be able then to link those into the providers. But we would love to be working more collaboratively with central government on some of those skills levers in order that we're able to be more agile for industry. I mean, and what we're finding is that there are some fabulous private sector providers that are coming forward now and are answering that. We've got people that are taking call centre workers on 25,000 a year and doubling their salary in 12 weeks through coding boot camps, and companies are paying for the cost of that because effectively a £50,000 a year coder would cost them £10,000 in recruitment fees. So there's lots of local innovation here that is helping with the problem, but to a certain extent we're still hamstrung with a lot of skills being centrally controlled, and any opportunity to get that closer to industry, which again is so granular. And I think Richard or Luke it was that talked about, it's very easy for government to work with Rolls-Royce or Jaguar Land Rover and these organisations of that scale. What we're able to do in Greater Manchester is to aggregate the needs of the smaller businesses, and particularly look at where there are common needs and develop programmes that then will satisfy those. Richard?
I mean, one of the things that we've got at the moment in the Growth Hub is the programme Skills for Growth, that is helping to companies to understand their skills requirements, put skills plans in place, and that helps to then, as you say, bring together a group of requirements that we can then take to providers and others, and they can help innovate as part of that solution. So I think there's a lot of really great work taking place, but it is within the limits of the levers that the city has at its disposal. So I think that the more things can be devolved, the more Greater Manchester can pull those things together, and indeed other cities and other locations, the more you can just get the system to work well together, and you're not having to try and line up lots of different things and spend your time hiding the wiring so Simon and others don't have to spend all the time understanding all the various bits of funding. So we do spend a lot of time. So I think Greater Manchester is in a good place, but it could do more.
Great. And then one very final question, a very brief one. I'm sure all of us on this committee would love to see a company like Simon's go through all of the research stages and eventually manufacture their product here in the Northwest. How capable are we of being able to do that here in the Northwest? And would a company like Simon's need to go overseas to secure that capability? I think Chris, if
yeah,
it's okay,
I mean, I think we've got we've got all the capability, and it's interesting that one of the worst pieces of news that we've had in the Northwest in terms of life sciences in the last 10 years was AstraZeneca's decision to pull out, to go its R&D facility to go to Cambridge, but the opportunity that's created, and we've already brought drugs to market at Oglesby Park since they vacated there. So I think we've got all of the we've got all of the things here in place in the region. We just need to recognise that, and I think it's great, but we've only got one Southern member of the committee. Sorry, two. The chairs here, but it would be And thank you both for coming. It would have been challenging to have it without the chair. But it is the geography does make a big difference. So much of what happens up here, and again because it's led by the private sector, it goes under the radar, and a lot of the the excellence in the private sector is these smaller companies. And then somebody like the Hutt Group suddenly floats and is worth £8 billion or whatever, and everybody wakes up and thinks, oh, there's some reasonable sized companies up there. We've got more unicorns per capita in Greater Manchester than anywhere else in Europe. We had another one last week, Matillon, an Altrincham-based business that was launched. That recently raised money. So I think the facility, the capability is here, the companies are here. We just need the recognition of that, and for the region to be viewed as a place of excellence, and then to bring the rest of the that disparity, to close that disparity in the region as well. Simon, what's getting in your way?
We're manufacturing in the UK. We are. Unfortunately, it's not in the Northwest. And what got in our way was simply capacity. Capacity here, particularly because so many of the vaccines are being made, or parts of the vaccines are being made here, then the capacity wasn't there to make something fairly small for a smaller trial like ours. So we did fight to keep it in the UK and have kept it in the UK. It would have been nice, as I said before, to actually have the trial here as well, and hopefully the next part of the trial will go on here. But the blocks really are capacity, and having more capacity in the Northwest.
And that's why, I mean, manufacturing is a key part of innovation, Greater Manchester, and the proposals up in Northern Gateway, or for that matter, around Wythenshawe Hospital for medicines as well. There's a number of, and we've got great excellence along the M56 corridor as well. But we're seeing a huge amount of demand at the moment for manufacturing in life sciences, in materials, etc. And it's going to be a real priority for us in this region to ensure that we develop those facilities for those manufacturers, because for the first time since the 1980s, I think we're seeing a significant increase in manufacturing in the region.
Richard?
Yeah, and I think, it's across a whole range of sectors, and over recent years we've been running a major programme for textiles and technical textiles, and I think one of the key things that's been really successful with that programme was that we're able to understand and get a lot of intelligence to understand where the key businesses were in their supply chains. If they went, there'd be a real knock-on effect. So that intelligence we've been able to pull together and understanding where some of the supply chain kind of issues were, that enabled that fund to really be well targeted. It's come to an end, that funding now, but that was a really successful model, I think, that combined the intelligence and deep intelligence together with supporting companies to come out with the propositions, but then targeting it around those bits of the supply chain where the investment was needed the most. So, but there's some incredible stories up here. And I think, with people like Chris and others, it's the fact that you've then got the property folk and the other folk, they can all come together to make that happen. And there's always that can-do attitude to make that thing. And it is possible because of people like Chris and Simon and the support infrastructure that sits around it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. I should point out for the record that I'm Middlesbrough born and bred, so I've got a foot in both camps. We'll go to Catherine Fletcher and then Erin Bell.
We are succeeding if he's come up with that fact on the public record, gentlemen. I'm listening to you fascinated and thinking about the kind of practical, right, what next? Because I think there is a really interesting story of recovery post-pandemic to tell. And I wanted to just return to one of the themes that we've heard evidence on earlier, which is about government-led R&D spending. The Northwest doesn't necessarily get, proportion to its efforts. It sounds like we've got a wonderful story to tell driven by the private sector. So at the risk of, nobody is going to say, no, don't give me more government money. But could you explain why we're achieving such good success with relatively less funding than the North East, Scotland, even London, and what, if we got more, we could do with the multiplier effect? Maybe if I start with Richard and then come across.
So I think we're doing well because there are a number of very large companies that are making some of those investments, because we've got that infrastructure and because we've got the collaboration. I think that's some of the reasons we're doing well. So even though there's less going into the system's pretty efficient and works well. And we've spent a lot of time trying to plug some of those gaps.
Yeah.
So for example, you know, we know one of the early stage gaps was around access to angel funding. So to really get the R&D flowing. So that's why we created GC Angels, which was about plugging that early stage gap and creating a co-investment fund. And that's been really successful in helping to develop a pipeline. We've heard about some of the other funds that have been developed as well. So I think that's why we're doing well, because we've spotted the problems and we've been able to kind of tap into
So the system, it's a systems-based approach. Sorry, I didn't interrupt, but yeah.
No,
I
absolutely.
understood you.
And we've always stood back and made sure that system's own and spent a lot of time understanding where those gaps are. And I think, you know, it's also a place where when those strategies have been developed, they've not just sat on the shelf. These are active strategies where people have really grabbed them, got behind them, and it's been a public-private getting behind those strategies to make it happen. Look at the ambitions that were set out for the tech sector 10 years ago, and to make Greater Manchester a centre of the tech industry. At the time, it was a long way from that, but the vision was set, everybody got behind it, and we're now one of the fastest growing tech centres in Europe. It's an incredible story with unicorns coming out of that from e-commerce, etc. What more could be done? I think you just put it on Superdrive if you got the extra investment in. But I think the key to it is about making sure that if that investment and some of those calls there, it can be really well aligned to some of the local sector specialisms. And I think for me, that's got to be key, that co-creation, co-design, that when calls are going out, it's really drilling down to some of those niche sectors in fintech, in healthcare, etc. that we've got here.
Sorry. Chris and then Simon, if you'd add anything to that, what could we achieve with more share of the public R&D?
Yeah, I think what you asked as well, what's the difference in this part of the world? I think the big difference in this part of the world is that we've got a global top 20 university here in Manchester, with the University of Manchester, plus some really fantastic vocationally focused universities as well, at Salford, at Bolton, at Manchester Met and UA92 now as well, Lancaster working in collaboration in Trafford. So a number of different universities, and we've got this really entrepreneurial economy as well. And when you put those two things together, then that's where we're really thriving, and we're seeing the sort of that, again, going back to that diffusion of R&D, as well as the sort of application of it to disrupt industries, as well as having those businesses that are really mining sort of deep research-based industries as well. So being able to harness the two together, and again, that's what we're looking to do through Innovation Greater Manchester, is to both unlock those businesses that are really are really driving the R&D forward, as well as those that are diffusing it. We also, though, would like to, under the sort of umbrella of innovation, is to then put money in the infrastructure that supports that, whether that be the physical infrastructure. And I would say this wouldn't as a property man, but we've got some big developments that are going to cluster industry, whether that be the likes of ID Manchester up the road here, the biggest innovation district that will make us one of the biggest innovation districts in Europe, or whether that be the Salford Research Triangle, building on the sort of the expertise at Media City and linking that in with the university and the hospital, or whether that be up in Rochdale, where the Advanced Manufacturing Productivity Institute is going to be an anchor of a big new manufacturing centre. And what we're looking to do is develop a network of innovation districts across Greater Manchester where businesses can thrive, and we link those then together, and link the businesses together with the skills and all of the other parts, and the funding and all the other parts as well. So we've got a sort of thought-through plan as to how we link all of these different things together, that whether that be the investment in the R&D itself, or whether that be investment in the infrastructure that supports it. But we're not just looking within our own city region. We've got Cheshire on the doorstep, we've got Staffordshire just to the south, we've got Lancashire and some great industry, and Cumbria with nuclear, etc. As well as actually linking to the northeast in terms of things like hydrogen and other areas as well. So again, the Northern Powerhouse has a big part to play in this, in terms of linking this across the north as well.
Very true. Simon, can you follow either of those two? Opus Magni.
Yeah, from my sector, from the health sector, what we have, I'd like to move the thought of the universities and the excellence in the universities, and bring in the hospitals as well. Certainly we have some of the best hospitals anywhere. Look at the Christies and the amazing work that they do. So how have we made the most of very little funding? Because of collaborating together and good old-fashioned northern grit, that we don't say no for an answer and we keep going and we push through. What I'd say to the committee is, look how much more we could do if we had that funding in place, and what the North West could do with that would be amazing.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. I think we're going to need to speed up a bit because we're asking more questions than we have time for. But I'm going to turn for a model of brevity to Aaron Bell and then Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and be quick, and thanks to all three of you. I'm just looking a little bit more specifically at the pandemic, and if I just ask this specifically to Richard, you know, how has the support you provide to local businesses changed since the onset of the pandemic, and how much of those changes do you think will become permanent or at least hybrid?
So one of the big changes was obviously switching everything to virtual. There was a much greater focus on making sure that businesses had access to the cash that was available. There was the government did step in and create a lot of facilities. I think one of the challenges was making sure that businesses could really access all of that. So we worked really closely with local authorities, local partners, with the banking sector to make sure there was a really clear call to action and a really simple process to get companies access to that finance. So that was the initial one, and then making sure that they could, wherever possible, get access to some of the innovation calls, etc., that came out that were pandemic specific. I think what kind of sustains, well, in many ways, a lot of the things we were doing were there beforehand in terms of those structures, and I think it's just about continuing to build on that and take those forward. So, and I think we've learned that we can do an awful lot, you know, remotely. We'll be keeping some of that going, but we'll also absolutely be doing more face-to-face activity. I think the big challenge in terms of keeping things going, though, is going to be making sure that we've got some real clarity over some of the big things that back this ecosystem. So things, you know, no doubt about it, ERDF and the structural funds have been a big role in enabling us to do what we do. Yes, we've been fortunate to get backing from the Combined Authority and others, but that removal of that ERDF funding and the lack of clarity about what comes next, that's a really big challenge for us and for many others as well in the system. So I think the sooner we can get clarity on that, I think that the one lesson I've learned, not just in the last kind of year and a half, but before that, is building up that collaboration, building up the faith in what we are doing is really important. And there's a lot of chopping and changing that takes place when it comes to business support, economic development, and we've been really fortunate here in Greater Manchester to have that consistency, and we've reaped the benefits of that. We need to keep that going, and that applies here and in other places as well.
Thank you. And the previous recessions, which have been driven by the economic cycle or indeed by the financial crisis, have led to declines in innovation and in R&D. Do you think it will be different this time because of the nature of the recession that we had was pandemic driven, and some of what we heard in the first session about, you know, you get this innovation in response to a crisis, and again, what additional support would be welcome, and specifically through the tax system as well, because Simon mentioned that earlier. You mentioned the R&D tax benefits. We've also got super deduction coming in. Is that going to help? So if we just go across, and then I will pass back to the chair because we are running short of time.
There's quite a few questions in there,
Yes,
so I'll try and address some of them. I think in terms of let's deal with the R&D. R&D tax, incredible, really useful, very popular, but there's still a lack of knowledge about it amongst businesses and amongst some of the private, especially some of the smaller professional service firms who advise those businesses. So I think there's a big awareness raising still to be done on that activity. I think the question mark of, are we going to see a real explosion of innovation? I really believe we are. I tend to be quite a positive person anyway, but I'm seeing it because we saw it during the pandemic. Yeah. A lot of it kept quite quiet, actually, because firms who were innovating and doing really well were a bit embarrassed at the time because they didn't want to celebrate. Hey, we're doing really well. I think telling those stories and celebrating the stories like Simon and others, that's what we've really got to shout about, because I think there is a real energy to adapt and change. And then what would help, I think the plans are set out really clearly in Innovation GM about how to do that, and it's about not just about the R&D spend at that top level, it's about the ecosystem, it's about the build, it's about making those connections and putting all parts of the system together.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, and certainly with the increased tax rates, then those tax credits are even more impactful. So yeah, customers are telling us that they're a big thing. And as far as in comparison with other recessions, one, because we're in the recovery phase now, so absolutely it's what's going to power us out of that. And the interesting thing is that through the recessionary bit, as we've pointed out, we had to innovate because it was such a sudden change. So no, unquestionably in my mind, the winners that we're seeing are those companies that are, that are investing in innovation in R&D. With it being private, again, we keep talking about private sector-led innovation in this region. If you go to a company and say, you know, you're thinking about innovation, we'll give you 25%, so you're getting a 3 times multiplier. 20%, you're getting a 4 times multiplier. That's the kind of that gives them the bravery to be able to go and do it. It can be so catalytic, and therefore, you know, I believe that at a local level that we're going to be able to identify those businesses that are actually absorptive of that kind of investment, and that will give you that kind of return on your R&D investment. But it is about creating an environment where companies actually understand what's available and they can see the pathways to that kind of money. But if we're able to do that, I think we'll get a much better return than historically has been benchmark.
And Simon, yeah, have you, I mean, we had the discussion about the specific drug, but have you felt supported otherwise by the government through the pandemic? And you know, what additional support would you welcome going forward?
So have we felt supported through the pandemic by the government? Not particularly, to be honest. One thing that did support us was the R&D tax benefit. As I said before, it's fantastic. It's a fantastic way to get extra money and allow you to innovate with that money. The change that I would make is to look at the ease for small companies in particular to get that R&D tax benefit. Currently, we're having to go through third-party companies, usually accountancy companies, who take up to 30% of your R&D tax benefit as their fee, and it would be nice if that was regulated a little more, so that there's a cap, or that they are giving you that benefit. You know, I would like to spend all of my R&D tax benefit on research and development. So if I was going to look at something, that's an area I'd certainly like to have a look at. As far as your other question on innovation, and are we going to increase innovation? In my sector, absolutely. Yeah. We were caught somewhat with our trousers down with COVID-19. We need to prepare now for the next pandemic, because it is coming and it will come, whether it's another COVID or whether it's something else. We have a cycle and we need to be ready for that cycle. So we need to look at how we can incentivize companies to look at future pandemic protection, so that we are prepared and fully prepared for next time, as well as helping out the NHS to cope with those pandemics.
Thank you. I'd love to ask more, but I think...
Thank you, Aaron. It's very kind. And finally to Dawn Butler in this session.
Thank you, Chair. It is true, I am the only southerner around the table. It's probably the reason why I'm the one feeling cold. But, I hear you on basically being able to get all of the, you know, the R&D expenditure, so you can spend it on R&D rather than paying accountant firms and stuff. That I didn't realise that they take as much as 30%. But I just want to talk also about repurposed medicine. What I hadn't realised was that because of the patent, that it's not commercially viable, so people don't invest because there's no money in it, basically. How do we, is it more fundamental then? How do we ensure that we prioritise healthcare as opposed to the profit that can be made from healthcare?
You know, profit from healthcare is something that drives R&D. That's for sure. So there has to be some ability to drive that R&D. But it's important that we make drugs affordable. And therefore, we have to find a way to find that middle road, that change the paradigm where very large companies are able to spend very large amounts of money on R&D, on new molecules. If there was an ability to take an older drug that has come off patent and either repatent it or find an incentive for that company to invest in bringing that to market, then the actual profit that comes out at the end of it is much smaller for that company. Because, in fact, what they're doing is they're selling that product at a much lower price than if they had invested in a new molecule. So, for example, a treatment that might be an enhanced older molecule, such as aspirin, that cost to the NHS is in hundreds per treatment, whereas newer treatments might be in thousands or even millions. So for some of the famous one is the one for a rare disease, which costs 1.7 million per treatment. So it's about finding that mixture of newer drugs and older drugs and encouraging invention, innovation, thought around how do we use those older drugs? How do we enhance them? How do we make them better? How do we reduce the side effects that they have? And allow the companies that are doing that to at least recoup the money that they've had to spend to get to market.
And what role can the government play in that?
Look at incentivizing those companies. So taking a company that has an older molecule and saying to them, look, we will help you to develop that molecule and allow you to maybe have an interim patent in this country where they can patent it for 5 years, 10 years, to allow them to actually sell that drug on an exclusive basis. The problem isn't profit-based, it's the fact that every single country and every single other manufacturer will jump on their R&D and sell their products on the back of it. So it's about protecting their research.
Interesting. I know we're out of time. I'd love to ask more questions, but thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Dawn. Can I thank our three witnesses? We had a bit of a taste of Greater Manchester in the last hour, and we're trying to distill it and to make it available to the rest of the country, whether it's through the Growth Hub, whether it's through the property development, or an example of a successful and innovative business in life sciences. I think you've done that very well. You've given evidence that we will draw on and make recommendations in our report. So thank you very much indeed for your time with us today. We're now going to move to our third and final panel of witnesses, who I'll introduce as they are taking their seats to save interrupting the broadcast of the committee. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Marianne Sensier, who is a research fellow here at the University of Manchester. Dr. Charles Knight, who is the Associate Dean of the University of Salford, another very important university, as was referred to in the last panel here, and James Baker, who is the Chief Executive of Graphene at Manchester, which includes the National Graphene Institute and the new Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre. Welcome both. Very grateful for your attendance here. Just picking up on some of the themes of the last session. Given that we're meeting after COVID and looking to the future, what do you see as the opportunities from your perspective, but perhaps particularly drawing on the Northwest and Greater Manchester, that point to the use of science and technology in driving that? Perhaps starting with Mr. Baker.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting today. So graphene, for those who are aware, was first isolated here in Manchester. What is it? It's a single atomic layer of carbon. Take sticky tape and some graphite, you can peel it. For me, though, the real difference is it has these unique and different properties for advanced materials. So for me, the opportunity is really advanced materials manufacturing fit very strongly into a lot of the conversation we've had today. Sustainability is probably one of the key ones. New energy sources, more sustainable construction. Again, listening to the news this morning, If you take cement, I think 10% of the global CO2 emissions are down to cement. So we could reduce the amount of cement. Not only would that reduce the amount of CO2, it could also make our buildings more sustainable, less CO2. So graphene as an example, we can add a very small amount of graphene to cement, and we can actually do the same equivalent performance for 30% less graphene, less cement, so less CO2. You can get rid of the steel, so you can actually make it cheaper, you can make it more affordable with less CO2. So for me, advanced materials help around that economic recovery. It could be on lightweighting of vehicles, it could be on new energy sources. So I think there's opportunity through advanced materials if we can find a way of accelerating them from the universities into products and applications. So for me, the agenda from earlier, talking about ERA and other institutes, is how do we take these new materials and take them into our products and applications at a pace that traditionally has taken many tens of years? How do we do that in single years or few years to really accelerate things like net zero? And for me, looking quite positively from the pandemic, we heard earlier that with our labs being closed and people not being able to work, that slowed things down. But I've actually seen an increase in innovation through the use of Teams, the use of Zoom, where you get people to actually come up with ideas, challenges, and then bringing people together to innovate. I think there's real opportunity. And I think earlier when you heard Chris and others speak about Innovation Greater Manchester, if we can create this ecosystem here between industry, academia, the creation of supply chain, I think by doing things different, there is real opportunity to create growth and meet targets like net zero. So graphene is just one example. We could go on to many stories around graphene, but for me, advanced materials, great strength here in the Northwest. There's the Royce Institute as well as graphene. Sheffield, I think Richard talked around earlier, the catapults. If we can bring those together in a unique way, I think we can create real value in a much different and quicker way than we have traditionally.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll come onto graphene in particular in a bit more detail, I'm sure. Perhaps I can turn to Dr. Sensier and then Dr. Knight.
Yes.
Perhaps you'd press your mic buttons, please. Thanks.
There we go. So the question is, what will help in recovery for the North?
What can we draw on here, especially in Greater Manchester, but obviously you look at the science and technology space more generally?
So, I mean, there's lots of strengths, obviously, to draw on in Greater Manchester, which were already highlighted in the local industrial strategy. Where I see the crisis and recovery from the crisis as essentially a window of opportunity that's open to make people think differently and transition to kind of new ways of working. And what you see is a problem, well, if you look back to the financial crisis, the evidence has shown that firms had difficulty accessing finance, particularly obviously as that was a banking crisis. But more kind of access to finance and more government incentives offered, particularly they talked about the Growth Company Innovation Voucher Scheme. I mean, you could use something like that to kind of confront these societal challenges, things like net zero, health and social care problems and energy security. These could kind of essentially be offered to companies to get them to transition and think about innovating in these areas. And particularly, I mean, strength in the Northwest is in nuclear. I actually live in West Cumbria, so I understand, you know, what's going on in the nuclear industry because my husband actually works for the nuclear industry. And essentially, you know, energy security, as we've seen recently, is incredibly important going forward. So investing in things like the small and advanced modular reactors, which at the moment the private sector, Rolls-Royce, have put seed funding towards, but this essentially needs to be scaled up, and places like Cumbria, Preston, Cheshire, where, you know, they've essentially lived with nuclear facilities, are very accepting of this. There's been a number of kind of social science projects done at the University of Cumbria, talking to the local community, what you think about new nuclear. I mean, this was particularly, well, before and around and with the advanced modular reactors. So, yes, definitely. I mean, a lot of this is high risk, so government essentially need to incentivize and underwrite this this space, because the private sector isn't going to step in without that kind of safety net and without that security of a long period of funding.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sensei. And Dr. Knight, give us the perspective from the University of Salford.
So I actually am not from a scientific background. I work in the business school at the university, and we work as a kind of facilitator across the institution for the wide range of STEM activities we engage with. So we have a new robotics lab. We have a facility called Energy House 2.0, which is looking at the future of energy. But I think, not to duplicate some of the points that have been made previously, if I can make a slightly different point, which is kind of about the skills agenda. In the previous panels, people mentioned about creative destruction, and we have seen a period of creative destruction. And I think there has been a little bit of, I don't want to use the phrase the new normal, but people trying to return to the past. You can never return to the past. We're never going back to the past. And I think one of the challenges for R&D, but one of the opportunities for R&D, is that there is an eroded link between place and role. And if I can give an example from a slightly strange place, I was at a dinner last night at the Salford Red Devils, and I was talking to a recruitment agency, someone from a recruitment agency, and they said they're currently recruiting people for technical skills from the Greater Manchester area for roles in London, but those people will never go to London. And so there are opportunities across the economy for levelling up, which doesn't involve the kind of brain drain that we've seen previously. But I think that what we need to underpin that is we do talk about the technical infrastructure, but there is a skills infrastructure. And if I can give you a University of Salford example, within the business school, we've recognised that business leaders of the future will need more technical skills than previously. So by 2023, 2024, all of our business school graduates will have a management degree or an economics degree, but they'll also have some discrete technical qualifications alongside that to do with data. Because we recognise that the use of data is going to be absolutely core to the UK economy. Especially, and if I can just give a final example, if we think about fintech was mentioned earlier, just this week, Chase has announced that it's going to move into the UK economy. Now, Chase, as a US company, has massive reserves to draw upon. And maybe attack is not the right word, but when they enter into the UK market, they can draw on those. And our homegrown fintechs may struggle against them. But that's where the kind of use of the R&D tax credit to support homegrown industry that can grow jobs and grow jobs we're here in Greater Manchester, I think will be absolutely vital in the near future. But we're never going to return to the past.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to turn to what I assume is your local MP, Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thanks very much. In terms of the impacts on universities and their ability getting that, it is like being on Zoom when you're on mute, isn't it? In terms of the way that universities have been impacted, certainly with Salford being an example, and I know that the University of Manchester is very similar, there's a lot of collaboration between business and the research element of the university, to the extent sometimes that I think universities become reliant on an income stream from businesses coming to carry out their own research. And Salford's case, I'd point to, the Energy House, where you've got different businesses coming in to test different types of insulation, and there's a whole range of other different departments that do the same thing. How have you been impacted financially as a result of that reduction in collaboration with the private sector during the pandemic? And starting with Dr. Knight first.
Thank you. So obviously there has been some impact. It's absolutely undeniable. But however, many of our facilities that we were undertaking, we're building a new science, engineering and environment building. I mentioned we've got a robotics innovation centre. They were already in plan, so they've already continued. You're absolutely right, though. I think in Greater Manchester, and one of the previous panellists mentioned this, one of the challenges has been many of the businesses in this region, especially in the Salford area, I'm an alumni of the university, by the way, are small to medium enterprises. And those small to medium enterprises are the ones that cannot take the shock of the pandemic in the same way that larger businesses have been. And I think one of the challenges has been that you're absolutely right, those businesses don't come forward. But to tie it to a previous panelist's point, we need to make it clearer to these small and medium enterprises the benefits of the research and tax credit, because I think it is a quite complicated scheme. And some businesses that I've worked with, I used to run a productivity and innovation centre, they're not actually aware that they can apply for the research and tax credits. And the multiplier effects that we've talked about before can be obvious. But there's obviously been an effect. And I think we need to think really carefully in the region. So as I know you're aware, we have the Salford Innovation Triangle, which is a collaboration between University of Salford's involved, Media City UK is involved, and other local industry and local government. And we have to think really carefully about, are we putting the infrastructure in place to allow those businesses to return to growth, but also to create the kind of jobs that we need to see in the near future? Because if we don't create that, we don't create the tax base of the future.
That's great. Dr. Sensier?
Well, I haven't got any direct evidence of this from the University of Manchester. Maybe James will have some more evidence, but I think in a way it's given people more chance to kind of cross-collaborate, because people have been at home and at the end of a Zoom call, essentially. So in a way there's probably been collaborations taking place that wouldn't have done normally. But I'm sorry, I don't have any evidence of that, apart from I've been talking to people in Middleton cooperating, which has been very interesting, helping to get that off the ground.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, I think Lou Curtis said, certainly if I use graphene in most buildings, the research has been affected because we haven't had people in the building. Our second graphene building, the GEEK, the Graphene Engineering Innovation Centre, is much more tactical around nearer term. So I've actually seen an increase in pace of innovation, partly because of the ability to collaborate. Traditionally, we may have waited for an industrial partner to come and visit, whereas now through Teams, we can do that initial engagement, we can have the conversation. So for me, as a real positive or lesson learned, is this combination of Teams, mute, and we've all got used to this now, doing the engagement, doing videos online. So graphene, what is graphene? You know, I can talk to 5 people, or I can do a video now and post it on social media and get to a lot more people. Concrete, as an example, is one of our hot areas. We put that on social media. It had 650,000 hits in 2 days because it fits sustainability, it fits the shortage of cement, it fits the shortage of lorry drivers. So for me, we're going to be able to use social media and other means to get some of our message across much quicker. But building on the theme of today, you've got to have some of those schemes to enable you to engage with industry. So we've been fortunate to have an ERDF-funded programme, we call it Bridging the Gap, which is aimed at SMEs to get them engaged in what is graphene, how do we work with you, how do we take forward. So for me, there's a question, what happens after ERDF, how do we use that? For me, I'm also a strong component, and I think this is something for government. I think it's about the risk comment earlier. We need to look at different innovation models. So it's actually good to fail. But if you're going to fail fast and learn and move on, rather than take 2, 3, 4, 5 years before you find out you've backed the wrong horse or the wrong area. So for me, this whole area of rapid innovation is something that I think we've learnt, and I think we're doing a lot better. Again, I don't want to talk all about concrete today, but 3 months ago, we laid the floor of a gymnasium near Stonehenge. It was risky. It was over 100 cubic metres of concrete. If it had failed, we'd have to dig it up and start again. But it actually was 30% less concrete, no metal reinforcement. It was cheaper cost. It cured quicker, so it actually didn't have as much labour. It's actually stronger. It doesn't crack. And already now we have a number of other pours that are taking place building on the back of that. But we really need government intervention to support, for example, certification and regulation of that if we're going to take it forward. So I think we've learned some lessons. I think there's some positives from it. But how do we retain that pace? Some sectors, aerospace as an example, really struggling. Although they're charging net zero, and from my background of aerospace, unless we start doing things different, we should have really started 20 years ago if we're going to meet the targets on net zero in the aerospace sector by 2035. So I think we need to look differently in terms of innovation. But if I put a positive on it, and it's a cautious positive, I think COVID has made us think differently and work differently, and we need to build on that and move forward if we possibly can.
just as a completely kind of random side issue, I get quite excited about the comments that you made about the cement and decarbonising the cement industry. And just very quickly, 2 points. Firstly, how far away are you from commercialising that so that we can roll it out across, the cement industry? And secondly, what support do we need from government to push that forward? Because that would be a game changer.
So for me, it is a game changer, and it's moving very quick. Some of our previous, so there's two things happening. One is it's new. So the challenge of a new material is less about the technology. It's more of the engineering, the certification, the testing, the qualification. So at the moment, we're laying floors. We've done the road, we've done the gym, and we've done the housing estate. For anyone who goes skating, there'll be another announcement in Manchester in the coming weeks that I'm sure you'll hear about. So it's a step forward, but it's not a high-rise building. It's not a roof. It's not a structure. Why is it not? Because we don't know all the answers today. So we don't know what's going to happen after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So it's not fully structural. So if we want to keep the lead, we've got to do a lot of testing, a lot of validation, a lot of verification. And some of that comes down to making cement, testing it. I think earlier there was a conversation around modelling. Maybe we use computer models, artificial intelligence to understand that. But for me, what can government do? It's really the acceleration of the verification, the testing, the validation of a new material. I think there was a question earlier around some of the vaccine testing. It wasn't about taking shortcuts in terms of validating a vaccine. It was about doing things in a much more systematic way that reduce the time it takes to validate a new material into the market. So it's not about shortcuts, it's about doing things in a smarter, more systems way to accelerate a new material into the market. And I think policy in terms of sustainability is one point, actually then supporting testing validation. Bruntwood talked about National Physical Laboratory, MPL in the north is something that we should be pushing for. How do we actually get some of that testing, that characterisation, measurement to validate new materials if we're going to accelerate them into the market?
That's great, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. We've got Dawn Butler and then Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Chair. I can't believe I'm getting excited about concrete as well, but it is actually very exciting in terms of the future. Where we go. And are we actually leading on this? Instead of we're the country that's leading on this in terms of graphene and concrete.
So graphene is open innovation. Lots of people are doing that. I believe we're leading in that we've developed what I call an engineered graphene solution, concrete solution. So people are adding graphene to concrete and getting improvement. For me, the work we're doing, I believe, is leading. Nowhere else in the world is doing the same, is having a structure like a floor. And for me, the novel bit is to have that with less concrete is the drive sustainability. But the area where we're absolutely leading is also reducing the need for metal reinforcement and rebar. So not only is that reducing further environmental impact of steel, it also reduces labour, so it's lower cost. It's Rebecca's point, why isn't everybody doing it? Is because there's still risk in terms of measurement, certification, before you would do that in everyday life. So we're leading, but for me, there's a great opportunity. Again, don't want to make a pitch. We've got interest from Brazil, we've got interest from Abu Dhabi. I know 2 weeks ago there was an announcement of a 10 billion investment. Again, expense of a Man United fan in here. I think there is just a Man City support Etihad. So the Geek is part funded through inward investment through Masdar out of UAE. There's great interest in terms of potential investment around UK, UAE. I think it's an area where we could actually try and make sure we are leading if we can get the investment to accelerate that certification, the patents. Again, it's not medical, but it's the same story. How do you patent the know-how of mixing cement? We've got to find a way of protecting that so we can exploit that and have a leading position in the UK and the world.
Great. What other innovations, like university-led innovations, have come out sort of during the pandemic? You say that you're all sort of working now closer together and...
So an interesting one is, which we don't really think about, is that UK universities are world leaders themselves in terms of education. And so if I broadly use the word EdTech to educational technology, if you look at how the UK universities quickly shifted from largely traditional teaching in person to moving online very quickly. We saw all sorts of innovations there which have changed the nature of education and will continue to change the nature of education. So to give you a very simple example, within the University of Salford and the Business School, our students this year will use far more simulations with real-world data, because during the pandemic, we had to think about ways to educate them online in ways that we'd never really considered. And what you've seen is a number of companies step into that space to provide products and services. Now, many of those are UK-based products and services which we can expand as a nation overseas, because traditionally the ed tech market, as I'll call it, has been dominated by North American companies. So even the process and act of how do we transmit and create knowledge and pass it to the next generation and get them involved, there's been an awful lot of activity. The other thing I'd say, which sounds really trite, but I think is kind of exciting, is the kind of knowledge exchange that was happening during the pandemic between institutions online. So, for example, previously, if you were trying to get someone, and I might try and get James to come and do something on concrete for me, if you were trying to get someone, it was always about the schedule, and I'll have to travel up and so on. The amount of cross-fertilisation of knowledge to our student body, who are the next generation of innovators, was much greater, because suddenly it was okay and easy to get people involved. I could get leading London academics involved and to collaborate. So there's that. But the other thing I would mention is just talking about the post-pandemic period. In Salford, part of the thing that there's a digital strategy across the region. And I do think there's lots of, within Salford at least, there's lots of new businesses bubbling up that we've collaborated with online. And I think we will, I'm quite optimistic, as some of the previous panelists were, we will see a lot of new innovative businesses. And what we need to make sure is, though, that they can find the right infrastructure in the area and they can find the right people with the right skills. Because if not, they will have to think about that.
So does that mean you now see an acceleration of innovation because everybody's so now interconnected? That should accelerate people's thought process because they've got more information.
Yeah, and I think so. From a management perspective, I think the other important thing that COVID did in the pandemic period was, and you talked about risk and the speed. If we look at just the government reaction to COVID and R&D funding for vaccinations, they sped up the R&D funding process to allow that to happen really quickly, and that was really important. But the core cultural thing that I think has changed, which we haven't really seen in the UK before, I think there is more of an appetite for risk, and there's more of an appetite for saying, let's do it quickly. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't, we move on. Because during the COVID period, for many of us, we had no choice. You know, I was involved in writing a university strategy for delivering online, which we did successfully. But I had to do that in a few days, basically. Previously, we'd have had committees, and 6 months later, we'd still be discussing it. Yeah. So I think the speed and the risk and risk is good in this context, for risk and innovation, I think is really exciting.
And are you saying it doesn't just benefit the universities, but it benefits the region because of the new business, or is there anything else in the way?
I think there's a massive amount of overlap, because as an institution, so the University of Salford and all the institutions in the region we're civic institutions. We're here as kind of anchor institutions to help in the wider region. So there's always that cross-fertilisation, there's always that collaboration anyway, but I think it's sped up. It's become easier for small businesses to access institutions, because if you're running a small business, even the act of saying, okay, I'm going to travel an hour to the University of Salford, meet someone for an hour, then travel back. If you're in an SME, that's a lot of time. Yeah. But now, somebody can have a meeting with me, I can give them some advice, and then they can get on with their day-to-day business. So I think there's just that speed, and I think there's an appetite, a good appetite for risk.
Thank you. Dr. Sensor, the university-led innovations?
Well, from my subject area, economics, there was a kind of immediate pivot from UKRI, the funding body, to give short-term grants to look at issues around the pandemic. And a website was set up, the Economic Observatory, which kind of essentially answered lots of kind of relatively basic economic questions, but lots of questions people had around the economy. What does it mean, this terrible hit to GDP? What are the region's unemployment profiles like? And all these things sprung up quite quickly within a few months and were kind of very useful in terms of suddenly academia became quite interesting to people because everybody was looking for stuff online. So there was also small videos and things like this which went along with the Economic Observatory. So yeah, I mean, it's brought a lot more people together. There's more collaboration. You know, you can collaborate with more people across the world. This morning I was on a Zoom call with people in Norway, and I didn't actually have to go to Norway. I only had to spend a couple of hours, you know, rather than take half a week to go to Norway. So this kind of collaboration has intensified and got greater. So hopefully academia has become more useful to society over this period by providing this information, and people, the public, realise, you know, they can look up these things. And I think so many people watched, you know, webinars on YouTube and podcasts and try and understand what was going on initially. So.
Great, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Dawn. We're now going to go to Aaron Bell and then to Chris Larson.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all three of you. Just if I can focus my questions specifically on the North West region. Firstly, we've heard already that in this area, private R&D investment is proportionately much higher than we see in other areas. As Catherine said earlier, you're not going to turn down more public sector investment, but what are your thoughts about the fact that here it does seem to be quite private sector led? And you know, is that a good model, or would the region benefit from a more even distribution of public-private? If I start with Dr. Knight.
It's an interesting question. I have to be careful not coming from a business school to give my kind of philosophical bent that I'm always interested in the private sector kind of leading these things. There's always a question that yes, more public support for R&D and more public support for, say, upskilling the region and levelling up. That obviously people are not going to say no. I think the question is about targeting. It's about if the private sector here is we've got more R&D funding, is that then a question of that we want to support those areas to become both national champions and then international world leaders? Or is it a question that we need to think about, are we therefore weaker in other areas in this region? So we do very well here on digital. Obviously, we've got all sorts of exciting research clusters here. So yes, to the idea of more public support, but I'd suggest, A, we'd need to think about the targeting, but B, going back to this point of speed, can we make sure that the process of people accessing it is quicker, and can we help people understand it better? Because interestingly, in doing a little bit of refresh reading for coming to this panel, the amount of advisors out there taking a cut to advise people on how to get R&D money is massively large. It's a growth industry in itself, and really, do we, as if I say as a taxpayer, do I want that R&D money going to a door opener to help people get R&D money, or do I want it all to go to the businesses? So I think it's about targeting, and it's also about thinking carefully about how people can access it quickly.
Thank you. Yeah, we heard about that in the previous panel as well, obviously. Dr. Sensi, I mean, I think you've just written a new policy paper about levelling up and regional resilience. You know, is public R&D the way to level up, or should it be more private sector led?
My belief and what I've read with the evidence is that private sector money follows public sector money. Private sector money is crowded in by public sector investment. And I think, you know, essentially, it's pretty amazing what has happened in the Northwest with being private sector led, because there are so many people here who want the Northwest economy to succeed for future generations, and obviously many other reasons. But, you know, you look at the example of, for example, this advanced machinery productivity institute which is being set up in Rochdale, which essentially is answering the demand for that industry to help it diversify ready for this century. And essentially that's been led by the National Physics Laboratory, Strength in Places funding, Rochdale Development Agency, some support from the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. All these groups have come together because they know that these skills, this training and the skills needed in this pipeline are lacking in this area. I mean, I don't know if you've visited the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Sheffield, just outside of Sheffield, in Rotherham. It's an amazing place to go to because essentially it's using those skills which have been developed over generations and training the next generation and taking people who may not necessarily go immediately to university to train them for the industries. The private sector industries are set up around that region. I mean, in fact, Professor Jones was essentially part of the reason that centre was established. But you need other routes for people to go into, not just university. I mean, if people are capable enough once they've done a couple of years of further education at the Advanced Research Centre, they then go on to maybe a 4-year funded degree with the company, so, they can continue training. But, we need the skills pipeline in these regions. We need nuclear investment. We need, particularly where I am in West Cumbria, there is about 4 institutions training in nuclear investment, but you need that kind of government seed funding to start off these industries of the future. If we are going to be global Britain, how are we going to compete if we don't have that same kind of underwriting from the government that all these other countries have? And we had that under the EU. It was silly to say that it's not because now we're of Brexit. We need to put that public money to really turbocharge the economy. Mm-hmm. If you look at the east of England, it's public money has, made the east of England a lot more profitable. Now there's 4 times as much private sector going in, but if you look in London, it's half as much. And London, you've got to remember back in the 80s, Mrs. Thatcher invested in Canary Wharf, she invested in the infrastructure, the Docklands Light Railway to go out there. The East End was a building site, it was a wasteland until it was invested in. And the financial service sector essentially was built on that. So that was a public investment that turbocharged the city. So really, people shouldn't be worried about paying their taxes back to this area. We need that public money to turbocharge the heritage in these regions, the industry.
Thank you. Could I just ask you both as well what lessons there are from previous crises? How did this region's science and technology sector fare during previous crises? And are there any lessons, or as we discussed in the previous panel, is this crisis different? I'll come back to you, Dr. Cencia.
So this crisis is obviously different because it's not a banking crisis. And this region suffered with the financial crisis. I mean, Greater Manchester, for example, didn't really recover till about 2012. But with the kind of the economic development policies laid down in Greater Manchester, the number of years they've worked with central government and they've encouraged funding streams, and essentially with the property development that went on in central Manchester, the build it and they will come, they did essentially have then a boom in jobs from about 2012. Salford, the BBC moving to Salford certainly increased the digital and media sector there. And it's not just the people on the payroll that you need to look at when you're looking at that data, because I've seen studies that say, oh, it hasn't had such a multiplier effect. There's loads of self-employed people who work for the BBC, and they're not necessarily showing up on the books of the BBC. So, there's the kind of multiplier effect there in the economy. So, I've forgotten the question.
You're saying is that the sector fared poorly in previous crises. And,
yes.
And the lessons this time are presumably more of the same in terms of that investment that you...
Well, the support didn't come in the last crisis, really, for the rest of the North West. Greater Manchester had its act together already. AGMA had been working collaboratively for a number of years. They had the funding from the airport as well, which helped. But, this crisis possibly hasn't hit sectors like the university as badly, apart from we don't really know exactly what's happening with student recruitment until probably a few months. It essentially, we need the support in the sectors, you know, the heritage sectors where the strengths already lie. And, you know, as Richard was saying, a number of places have put in for the Strength in Places Fund a number of great bids. There was one at the university that I worked on that was working with the health economy. And, you know, essentially pitting places against each other is a waste of resources, I think, because you've got a lot of competition, you had some great ideas, lots of people coming together, and then they're only funding about 25% of those ideas. So those kind of funds, I think, need to be boosted, particularly in recovery.
Thank you. Dr. Knight, any historical perspective?
It's very difficult to follow an economist on the economy. If I take a slightly different tack, which is I'm actually originally from North Shropshire. Owen Patterson is my MP, and if we go slightly forward-looking, because you've covered the past in quite a lot of detail, I think one of the things we're seeing here now is that the pandemic has accelerated interest in things like productivity, in robotics, automation, and so on. And I mentioned earlier we have a new facility at the institution which is about robotics, artificial intelligence, infrastructure, and so on. My slight worry is that I'm very, very positive about the Northwest and the ability of the Northwest and Greater Manchester to continue to attract both private and public money. However, when I visit my family in North Shropshire, which is where I'm from, I'm actually very concerned about the potential cascading ramifications for them. Lots of my friends work in low-skilled side of the economy, and many of them, I predict, their jobs will be automated within the next 10 to 15 years. And so I do wonder what will happen to my hometown, because I see somewhere at Northwest region, Greater Manchester, both creating new jobs, new innovations, and so doing very well out of this area. But I think if we're not careful, there'll be all sorts of ramifications. Now, economic theory would, and I have got an economist to my left, would teach us that new jobs will be created, but will they be created in the kind of towns that I'm from, which is in North Shropshire? So I think the picture's going to, I'm very optimistic about the picture here. I'm just worried if we can see that across the UK economy as a whole.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, did you want to add?
Again, I think my main observation is for me, it's about sustainability come out of the pandemic. So this drive towards sustainability on the funding, you know, if I look at our second building, it's 100% industry funded. Where government could probably play a bigger role. Again, as an example, I won't talk about concrete roads. Next week, we're doing 3 kilometres of the A1 driven by national highways. So again, part of the infrastructure, why graphing in roads? We want a road that's no potholes, less maintenance, more productivity, but also sustainable. Stop planting trees when we build a bypass, use more recycled, sustainable materials. So I think there could be more intervention from government around driving sustainability. And I think certainly if I look at what's here in the Northwest, but I'll go broader than the Northwest to the North, you know, in terms of manufacturing, I think when you look at construction, it is about local supply chain. So again, concrete building is all about local supply chain. We need to build that. So I think that can have a tail, if you like, not just in the high end, but also in terms of the materials, the manufacturing, and then the labour associated with that as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And finally to Graham Stringer.
Just a quick question to we're hopeless on this side, aren't we? To James, I mean, you mentioned graphene. When the discoverers of graphene came before the Science and Technology Committee, they said the government of George Osborne had helped the government to put quite a lot of money into the graphene centre, but it had gone into bricks and mortar and not into graphene. Do you think the government could have done more in terms of the development of graphene itself as opposed to just providing buildings?
Yeah, famous Andre comment. I think, first of all, the context for me of new materials, whether it's graphene or any new material, it takes traditionally, my background's aerospace, 25 years from first discovery through to products in the marketplace. So for me, the first thing they needed was a building to bring together the research, that brought together the physicists with the material scientists, with the chemists. And the first graphene building did very much that. It's very much around the science, using technology readiness level. It's a new discovery, the new science. And I actually use the term graphenes now. And we're not just talking about graphene. There are many different types of graphene. There are over 100 2D materials. If you look at the future, a bit like Lego bricks, we'll be creating stacks of multifunctional material. So for me, that building was essential towards that first bit, but it also needed more emphasis on the translation. I think that came up earlier. And that's where the second facility came in, the GEEK, and that's aligned with the catapults, which is more about the translation of that science into products and applications. So for me, again, as a simple analogy of a three-legged stool, we still need that fundamental science, that research, that curiosity-driven science. ERA came up earlier about driving that curiosity, new science. But we also need the infrastructure, the equipment, the facility to do that translation. And for me, the challenge we're all trying to face is, in a very simple language, I look at an innovation as a process. We design something, we then need to make it, and we need to validate it. If we can do that in a much more concurrent systems way, I like the design at the moment. We've all talked about it. We can now do that virtually. We can have Zoom. I've met your Solfeed colleagues virtually over the last 18 months, but I probably never would have met them under a normal world. So how do we do that design quicker? But then we need the infrastructure and facility and government of help there to build things like the NGI, the GEEK, the Royce, the kit, the facilities to do that experimentation. But then we need to do that very rapid engineering and validation, which is probably where at the moment we're not doing as well as we might do. And that's why some of that technology goes overseas to me.
I know nobody ever says no to more money, but do you think we could have been much further down the track with graphenes had the government been quicker on the draw and put more cash in earlier?
Andre would have done more science. We probably now have 500 2D materials rather than 100. So I think we could have put more money into science. So I think there's been a lot of progress around the different 2D materials. The fact is it takes time to do the different sectors. We talked about concrete. If you had £20 million tomorrow, we'd put more people testing and validating concrete and would do it quicker. If you wanted aircraft or hydrogen, we could put... So each of those verticals, I'm sure we could put more focus and emphasis. I don't think it's money for industry. I think it's, for academia. It's building that supply chain is probably the bit that we've got to do better. And I think government's got a role in that. But it's how we build that supply chain in a smarter way is a key challenge going forward.
Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Graham, and thank you to our witnesses for giving us the opportunity to reflect on and draw on your thoughts on how we learn some of the lessons from the pandemic and apply them to our future development. Can I, on behalf of my colleagues, thank the University of Manchester for hosting us today, and to thank our clerks team for the efforts that they put into putting today together, and to our broadcast colleagues for making sure the rest of the country, and indeed the world, can have an insight into what has been going on in the North West through the testimony of our witnesses. That concludes this meeting of the committee. Order, order. Thank you very much indeed, folks.
Thanks.